Hair Tweet 1, The Confrontation. Step aside, boy, you don't look like you belong in first class. The words hung in the air of Liberty International Airport's Terminal B like smoke, acrid and impossible to ignore. But Marcus Taylor didn't hear them. His noise-canceling Bose headphones formed an acoustic barrier between his focused mind and the chaotic symphony of airport sounds, the staccato announcements, the rolling luggage, the distant whine of jet engines spinning up for departure. The hum of central air conditioning at Liberty International Airport provided a low, monotonous drone, a backdrop to the staccato announcements for final boarding calls and delayed baggage information. Gate B12, serving the 4:15 p.m. flight to Chicago, existed as a microcosm of anxious stillness. Passengers sat hunched over glowing screens, babies fussed, and a general air of impatient waiting hung thick as the smell of stale cinnamon rolls from the nearby food court. Marcus Taylor sat apart from the main cluster, his back against a wide pillar. He preferred the edge of crowds. At 26, he wore his clothes with an easy, unstudied elegance, a dark tailored traveler's blazer over a simple gray Henley, dark jeans, and clean leather Cole Haan sneakers that walked the perfect line between professional and comfortable. His bag, a worn but high-quality leather duffel from Shinola, sat at his feet, containing everything he needed for 2 days in Chicago, a change of clothes, toiletries, his laptop, and most importantly, the notes for tomorrow's keynote speech at the National Bar Association conference. His focus was entirely on the legal brief displayed on his tablet. His brow furrowed in concentration as his headphones fed him a steady stream of instrumental jazz. Miles Davis, the kind of music that activated the analytical part of his brain without distracting the creative side. The brief concerned a class action lawsuit against a pharmaceutical company that had knowingly released medication with dangerous side effects in predominantly black neighborhoods while withholding it from wealthier white communities. The statistical evidence was damning, but translating data into a compelling narrative that would move a jury required finesse. He highlighted a passage and made a note in the margin, completely unaware that he had become the focus of unwanted attention. His Harvard law diploma might be framed in his Manhattan office, but it offered no protection here. His first-class ticket to Chicago might be loaded on his phone, but it wouldn't shield him from what was coming. The gold watch on his wrist, a graduation gift from his father, wouldn't stop the minute hand from ticking toward a confrontation that would change multiple lives in the span of 15 minutes. Marcus Taylor was just a man trying to finish some work before his flight. He was a professional doing what professionals do, maximizing every minute of his day, focused on making a difference through the legal system he had dedicated his life to mastering. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was entitled to do. But to the officer now watching him, he was a problem that needed solving. Officer introduction. Richard Peterson stood with his arms crossed, feet planted shoulder-width apart in the authoritative stance he'd perfected over 14 years with the Liberty International Airport Police. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his boots polished to a military shine, and his utility belt arranged with meticulous precision. Taser, radio, handcuffs, and pepper spray all within perfect reach. The badge on his chest caught the fluorescent lighting, gleaming like a small sun. Peterson was a man built on a framework of rigid certainty. He saw the world in black and white, in compliance and defiance. Once, he'd been proud to serve, to protect. He joined airport security 2 months after 9/11, filled with patriotic zeal and a genuine desire to keep America safe. But over 14 years, that zeal had curdled into something darker. In the last few years, a bitter resentment had taken root in him, a feeling that the world was coddling those who didn't deserve it. That respect for authority, for his authority, had evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. His recent performance reviews noted his increasing rigidity and failure to adapt to modern community-oriented security approaches. His supervisor had suggested refresher training in de-escalation techniques. Peterson had nodded through the meeting, signed the forms, and promptly filed the feedback away in the mental folder labeled liberal nonsense. "This airport's gone soft," he muttered to his partner, Officer Elena Rodriguez, as they stood near the jet bridge entrance to Gate B12. "Back when I started, people knew to respect the uniform. Now everyone's got rights. Everyone's filming. Makes it damn near impossible to do our job." Rodriguez, 7 years his junior and significantly more by the book, glanced up from checking the manifest on her tablet. At 31, she represented everything Peterson resented about the new breed of security personnel. Educated criminology degree from Rutgers, tech-savvy, and worst of all, concerned with passenger experience metrics and community feedback scores. People still respect the uniform, she replied evenly. They just expect respect in return. The new training modules are actually pretty good. Richard, the de-escalation techniques. I don't need sensitivity training to do my job. Peterson cut her off, his voice sharp with irritation. I need people to follow instructions the first time, not record me with their phones while asking for my badge number. You weren't here before all this implicit bias garbage. Used to be we could actually stop suspicious people without filling out 20 forms justifying why we looked at them sideways. His gaze swept the seating area in a practice patrol pattern. It slid past a sleeping businessman in a rumpled suit, ignored a frantic family wrangling 3 young children, and landed with a heavy magnetic pull on Marcus Taylor. Peterson's eyes narrowed. See that guy, he muttered to Rodriguez, a subtle nod toward the pillar. Rodriguez followed his gaze, the one on the tablet. What about him? Look at him, Peterson said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Too calm, too neat, sitting separate, headphones on, thinks he's better than everyone else. He's been watching us. Rodriguez squinted in confusion. He's reading Richard. He hasn't looked up once since we've been standing here. That's what they want you to think, Peterson said, shifting his weight impatiently. It was a classic Peterson leap of logic. He didn't see a passenger. He saw a profile. Young, black, well-dressed, and aloof. To Peterson, this combination screamed arrogance. And arrogance, in his book, was a short step from suspicion. He fits the description, Peterson continued, his mind already building a case. The bolo from this morning, male, mid-20s, suspicious behavior. The bolo said a subject in a red hoodie with a backpack, last seen near Terminal A. Rodriguez corrected him, her brow furrowing. This guy is wearing a blazer at Terminal B. That's literally the opposite of the description. Peterson's jaw tightened. Profiles change, they get smart, they blend. Maybe he ditched the hoodie, stashed the backpack. These guys switch him up appearances all the time. That's Security 101. Rodriguez shook her head slightly. I really don't think. Let's run a random check. Just standard see something, say something diligence. Come on. He didn't wait for her agreement, already in motion, his boots making heavy, deliberate sounds on the tiled floor. He enjoyed this part, the interruption, the instant flash of recognition in a civilian's eyes when they realized their day was about to be officially disrupted. In Peterson's experience, everyone had something to hide. It was just a matter of applying enough pressure to find out what it was. Initial approach, Marcus Taylor didn't see him coming. The first indication he had that something was wrong was a shadow falling across his tablet screen, disrupting the flow of legal text he'd been analyzing. He looked up, his music-induced focus evaporating as he registered the 2 officers looming above him. The man, broad and imposing, was staring at him with a look of profound, challenging expectation. The woman behind him looked vaguely uncomfortable. Marcus pulled his headphones down to his neck. Can I help you, officers? His voice was polite, measured. We'll see, Peterson said, his voice a gravelly monotone. He deliberately didn't introduce himself or explain his presence. I need to see some identification and your boarding pass. Have you ever been publicly humiliated by someone who had no idea they were destroying their own career in real time? This isn't just a story about airport profiling. It's about what happens when the wrong man is handcuffed by the wrong officer at exactly the wrong moment. Is there a problem? Marcus asked. His gaze even. He wasn't scared. This wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement, but he was annoyed. This was not the first time his presence in a space had been questioned simply because of how he looked. There won't be a problem if you just comply, sir, Peterson said, putting a slight sarcastic emphasis on the sir. ID and boarding pass. Now, around them, the conversations at Gate B12 didn't just quiet. They died. The air crackled with sudden attention. This was no longer just waiting. This was a scene unfolding, a disruption to the monotony of airport tedium. A middle-aged businesswoman, Vanessa Porter, looked up from her laptop, her fingers freezing on the keys. The gate agent, Frank, paused his typing, with a slow, deliberate sigh that spoke volumes about his internal state. Marcus reached into his blazer's inner pocket. Of course, officer. He pulled out a slim leather wallet and his phone, which held his digital boarding pass. He handed the wallet, open to his driver's license, to the officer. Peterson took the wallet, his eyes never leaving Marcus's. The power move was deliberate, establishing dominance through sustained eye contact while withholding the common courtesy of actually looking at the provided documentation. Finally, he glanced down at the ID. Marcus Taylor, he read aloud. New York license. What are you doing in New Jersey? Connecting, Marcus said simply. My flight to Chicago is right here, as you can see from the boarding pass. He held up his phone, but Peterson ignored it. What's your business in Chicago? Peterson pressed, shifting his weight forward subtly, invading Marcus's personal space inch by inch. I'm visiting family, Marcus said, a small, tight lie. He was keynoting the National Bar Association Conference on Constitutional Law Enforcement, but family was simpler. It was none of this officer's business anyway. Family, Peterson repeated, as if the word tasted bad in his mouth. And what's in the mind? He nodded toward the duffel at Marcus's feet. My bag. Marcus looked down at his duffel. Clothes, a laptop, my work materials. What kind of work? Marcus's patience, normally a deep well, was beginning to shallow. I'm a lawyer. Now, if you're quite finished, officer, they're about to call my boarding group. This was the wrong answer. Peterson's face tightened, a subtle shift in his jaw that betrayed his internal reaction. A lawyer, Peterson scoffed, a tiny, ugly smile playing on his lips. He passed the ID to Rodriguez. Run this. Check for warrants. Full check. Officer, you have no probable cause to, Marcus began, the lawyer in him automatically engaging. Don't you tell me about probable cause. Lawyer, Peterson snapped, jabbing a thick finger toward Marcus. I have reasonable suspicion. You fit a profile. What profile exactly? Marcus asked, his voice dropping, getting colder. The reading while black profile, the wearing a blazer at an airport profile. A few passengers gasped. Vanessa Porter's eyes widened. Nearby, a teenage girl whispered something to her mother. Peterson's face flushed a dull red, the color creeping up from his collar like a tide. The challenge to his authority, made so publicly, was the final straw. Okay, smart mouth. You know what? You're not just being checked. You're being detained. Peterson's hand dropped to his belt. Stand up. Put your hands behind your back. You are not serious, Marcus said. Standing up, not to comply, but to be eye level with the officer. He was taller than Peterson by at least 2 inches, a fact that seemed to infuriate the officer even more. You are detaining me for what? For asking a question, for knowing my rights, for interfering with a police investigation. Peterson's voice rose. For suspicious behavior, for whatever I want. Rodriguez looked alarmed now. Richard, she said quietly, maybe we should. Last chance that Peterson cut her off, his hand now resting on his handcuffs. Turn around. No, Marcus said, his voice ringing with a sudden hard authority that silenced the entire gate area. I have done nothing wrong. I have provided my identification. I am not interfering. You are interfering with me. You are engaging in a biased, targeted stop, and I am not going to. Peterson didn't wait for him to finish. Escalation begins. A lawyer Peterson's scoff carried across the terminal, drawing even more attention from nearby gates. Right, and I'm the Attorney General. His eyes flicked over Marcus's blazer with naked suspicion. Where'd you get the fancy clothes? Your law firm must pay well. His fingers made air quotes around law firm, the gesture dripping with disbelief. You people always have some story, Peterson continued, loud enough for the nearest passengers to hear. Some excuse why you're somewhere you shouldn't be. The word you carried the weight of generations of prejudice, hanging in the air between them, like poison. Officer, Marcus replied evenly, I'm simply trying to board my flight like everyone else here. Everyone else, Peterson countered. leaning closer. Has actual business being here. Everyone else follows rules. Everyone else, his voice dropped to a near whisper, knows their place. The last three words carried such naked hostility that several passengers flinched. Vanessa Porter's fingers moved to her iPhone, making sure her recording captured every syllable of what was rapidly becoming textbook discrimination evidence. Marcus's AirPods Pro fell silent as Peterson approached, the noise cancellation deactivating as if sensing the confrontation. His iPad Pro displayed the brief he'd been annotating through Legal Edge AI's collaborative platform, a $40 million class action case that would now have to wait. Nearby, college student Sophia Williams had already tagged three major civil rights organizations on her Be Real post, the unfiltered airport confrontation replacing her planned casual travel update. Her caption, "This is America 2025 still happening IRL," triggered immediate shares across her Northeastern University social network. "Sir," Rodriguez interjected, trying to de-escalate. "Perhaps we should just verify the boarding pass and—" "No," Peterson cut her off, the vein in his temple visibly pulsing. "I'm conducting a proper investigation here." He turned back to Marcus. "Empty your pockets, all of them. On the seat. Now." Marcus did not move. "Officer, I provided identification. I've answered your questions. You have no legal basis to search me or my belongings." "Oh, so now you're refusing a direct order." Peterson's voice rose again, taking on a dangerous edge. "That's suspicious behavior right there." The Liberty Airport official alert system pinged as multiple passenger complaints began flooding in through the airport app. Terminal B security supervisor notifications lit up with reports of potential profiling incident and officer misconduct. But help was still minutes away. "I'm not refusing anything legal," Marcus clarified, his training as a constitutional lawyer evident in his precise language. "I'm declining an unlawful search that violates my Fourth Amendment rights." Peterson's face darkened further, a storm gathering in his expression. "Fourth Amendment. Let me tell you something about rights. In this airport, I determine what rights apply. Security supersedes your constitutional law school theories." Marcus remained calm, but his heart rate had elevated to 97 BPM according to his Apple Watch, which had automatically activated its emergency recording feature, a new function designed specifically for documenting law enforcement encounters while transmitting location data to emergency contacts. "That's not how constitutional law works." "Officer," Marcus said, maintaining his composure despite the adrenaline now coursing through his system, "the Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable searches and seizures without probable cause. You have established no probable cause." More phones emerged from pockets and purses around Gate B12. James Patterson, a technology executive heading to Chicago for a conference, had already begun live streaming to his professional network on LinkedIn. His caption, "Witnessing potential civil rights violation at Liberty International," was drawing immediate attention from his 12,000 connections. "Richard," Rodriguez said more firmly, placing a hand on her partner's arm, "we should call Supervisor Garcia. Protocol for disputed detentions requires supervisory presence before escalation." "I know the damn protocol," Peterson snapped, shrugging off her touch. "And I know a suspicious individual when I see one." Marcus maintained his composure, but his legal mind was cataloging each violation, each overreach. "Officer Peterson," he said, reading the name badge for the first time. "I'd like to speak with your supervisor. Now." "How do you know I haven't called for him already?" Peterson challenged, his nostrils flaring slightly. "Maybe he's on his way to help process you properly." "Process me," Marcus repeated, a hint of indignation finally breaking through his professional facade. "I'm a passenger, not a suspect. I'm standing at my gate with a valid ticket." "Allegedly valid," Peterson countered, his chin jutting forward aggressively. "Until proven otherwise. Everything about you is allegedly legitimate." The gate agent, Frank Rivera, had picked up his phone. Protocols required staff to alert management immediately about security incidents that could affect boarding. The Chicago flight was scheduled to begin boarding in just 12 minutes, and this situation showed no signs of resolution. Vanessa Porter had stood up, moving slightly closer, her iPhone capturing every word. As Chief Diversity Officer for a Fortune 500 company, she recognized textbook discrimination. Her corporate training modules featured scenarios less blatant than what she was witnessing. "Sir," she called to Peterson, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to boardroom confrontations. Is there some specific security concern here? This gentleman seems to be complying with all reasonable requests. Peterson turned, his authority challenged from a new direction. Ma'am, please stay back. This is a security matter. I'm just curious what security protocol calls for this level of interaction with a passenger who's presented ID. Porter pressed, her voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to boardroom confrontations. I developed corporate compliance training, and I'm having trouble identifying which TSA guideline is being followed here. Interference with a security investigation is a federal offense, Peterson warned, his hand instinctively shifting toward his handcuffs again. The gesture wasn't lost on the watching crowd, several of whom audibly gasped. The moment hung suspended in the terminal air, a tableau of modern America captured in the unforgiving fluorescent light of Gate B12. In the seconds that followed, lives would change, careers would end, and a routine power trip would transform into a landmark civil rights case. The physical confrontation. Peterson moved suddenly, the contained frustration of the encounter exploding into physical action. That's it. You're under arrest. He grabbed Marcus's arm with a practiced grip, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. The motion was smooth, executed with the muscle memory of countless similar apprehensions, but the aggression behind it was unmistakable. You're resisting, Peterson yelled, creating his own reality. Stop resisting arrest. Marcus, a former college track athlete, instinctively braced himself, but he made no move to strike back. I am not resisting, he stated, his voice deliberately loud for the benefit of the recording devices surrounding them. You have no right. This is assault. Richard, stop, Rodriguez yelped as Marcus's ID clattered from her hand to the floor. She saw the cameras. Everyone had a phone out. The scene was metastasizing from a simple stop to a full-blown incident that would certainly trigger reviews. But Peterson was gone, lost in the red mist of his own power. He saw Marcus's composed resistance as the ultimate challenge to his authority, and he responded with escalating force. With a practiced move, he slammed Marcus against the pillar, pressing his cheek against the cold surface. When an officer gives you a command, you comply. Peterson's voice had risen to a near shout, his face inches from Marcus's ear. You don't argue about rights. You don't question procedure. You comply. The sound of handcuffs unsnapping from Peterson's belt cut through the shocked silence of the gate. The metallic click as the first cuff locked around Marcus's wrist echoed like a gunshot. Marcus made a split-second decision. Rather than physically resist, which would only escalate the situation and potentially give Peterson legal justification for his actions, he went into full documentation mode. I am Marcus Taylor, he announced clearly, projecting his voice for all the recording devices. I am being detained without cause by Officer Richard Peterson at Gate B12 Liberty International Airport at approximately 3:45 p.m. on November 3rd, 2025. This officer has provided no legitimate reason for this detention. I have presented identification and my boarding pass. I have answered all reasonable questions. This is a violation of my Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. His Harvard law training was evident in the precise, evidentiary quality of his statement. He was creating a record, one that would withstand legal scrutiny. Shut up, Peterson snapped, clicking the second handcuff into place with unnecessary force. You have the right to remain silent. Use it. But Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the handcuffs biting into his wrists and the humiliation of being restrained in public. Officer Peterson has demonstrated clear bias in his approach in questioning. He has escalated a routine inquiry into a physical detention without establishing reasonable suspicion of any crime. His words carried the calm precision of someone who had taught constitutional law, which, in fact, he had as a guest lecturer at Columbia Law School. Even in this moment of personal indignity, the attorney in him was meticulously building the case that would later dismantle Peterson's career. Vanessa Porter had moved closer, her iPhone capturing everything in 4K resolution. I am witnessing this, she stated clearly. This appears to be a clear case of racial profiling and excessive force. I am Vanessa Porter, Chief Diversity Officer at Meridian Global, and I will provide testimony if needed. Sophia Williams' live stream had jumped to 1,700 viewers and climbing rapidly. The comments section exploded with reactions, Justice Seeker 92. This is outrageous. Law student 2025. Someone call the ACLU truth teller. That officer is out of control. Flight attendant YC. I recognize that passenger from previous flights. He's a regular business traveler. Right side view. This is America in 2025 still happening. Rodriguez looked horrified, caught between partnership loyalty and professional ethics. Her training and de-escalation techniques screamed at her to intervene. Richard, she tried again, her voice sharper now. We need to call this in. Now, this is becoming a level 2 incident. Peterson ignored her, focused entirely on completing the arrest. You're being detained for interfering with a security investigation, for suspicious behavior, and for resisting arrest. He recited the charges as if reading from a script he'd written himself. Marcus, now fully handcuffed, was turned to face the crowd of shocked onlookers. The indignity of the moment might have broken someone with less resolve, but Marcus's expression remained composed, his eyes clear and focused. This wasn't just happening to him. He was observing it, cataloging it, preparing for what would come next. I need a supervisor immediately, he stated calmly. I also need to make a phone call, which is my right even under airport security protocols. You'll get your call when I decide you get your call, Peterson retorted. Grabbing Marcus's duffel and placing it on a seat, he began rummaging through it without consent, pulling out neatly folded clothes and Marcus's laptop. That's an illegal search, Marcus noted for the record, his voice steady. You have no warrant, no probable cause, and I have not consented to a search of my belongings. Peterson pulled out a leather portfolio with embossed initials, MLT. He flipped it open, revealing legal documents with the letterhead of Taylor & Associates Law Group, one of the most prestigious civil rights firms in the country. His eyes skimmed the text, but in his adrenaline-fueled state, the significance didn't register. What's this more fake credentials? Peterson tossed the portfolio aside dismissively. James Patterson's LinkedIn livestream had attracted the attention of several legal professionals in his network. Comments from attorneys were pouring in, that's a clear Fourth Amendment violation. Is that Marcus Taylor from Taylor & Associates? Someone needs to call Jonathan Taylor immediately. This officer has no idea who he just handcuffed. Rodriguez had picked up her radio, her professional ethics finally overcoming her reluctance to undermine her partner. Dispatch, this is Officer Rodriguez at Gate B12. We have a situation requiring supervisor presence. Immediately, her voice carried the unmistakable tone of urgency. The radio crackled. Copy that? Rodriguez? Supervisor Garcia is en route. ETA 3 minutes. But 3 minutes can be an eternity when you're handcuffed in public. Marcus stood with perfect posture despite the awkward position of his restrained arms. His shoulders squared, chin up. His eyes scanned the crowd, noting each recording device, each potential witness. Despite the humiliation burning inside him, his legal mind was fully engaged, recognizing that this moment, if handled correctly, could matter beyond his individual experience. Officer, he said with quiet dignity, I'm going to remain silent now until a supervisor arrives. But I want everyone present to know that what is happening here is not just wrong, it's illegal, and it will be addressed. Peterson sneered, but something in Marcus's calm confidence had begun to unsettle him. This wasn't playing out like his usual intimidation scenarios. The handcuffed man wasn't begging or threatening. He was documenting. And the crowd wasn't deferring to the uniform. They were recording, commenting, bearing witness. We'll see how calm you are when you're explaining to TSA why you're not getting on any flight today. Peterson muttered, but the bravado in his voice had diminished noticeably. What neither of them knew was that Sophia Williams's live stream had already been picked up by a local news desk. The first media alerts were being prepared. And somewhere in Manhattan, Marcus's father, Jonathan Taylor, was about to receive a notification that would set in motion one of the most significant civil rights cases in recent airport security history. Pair tweet 2. The revelation the airport's Wi-Fi network strained under the sudden surge of video uploads and live streams originating from Gate B12. What had begun as a routine security stop had transformed in minutes into a viral moment of injustice, captured in real time, spreading across platforms with the unstoppable momentum of breaking news. Sophia Williams's hands trembled slightly as she held her phone steady, capturing every second of Marcus's detention. Her TikTok live stream counter ticked upward with alarming speed: 5,000, 12,000. 23,000 viewers now witnessing Officer Peterson's abuse of power. The comments flooded in faster than she could process. This is straight up racial profiling. What gate I'm in? Terminal CFO. Coming there now. Someone tag ACLU Civil Rights now. That officer needs to be fired immediately. Isn't that Marcus Taylor from that Supreme Court case last year? As a sociology major at Northeastern studying racial disparities in law enforcement, Sophia recognized the academic theories of power dynamics playing out before her eyes. But this wasn't a textbook case study. It was happening to a real person, yards away from her. I'm live streaming from Gate B12 at Liberty International Airport, she narrated, her voice tight with tension. A black professional man has been handcuffed after simply sitting and working on his tablet. He identified himself as a lawyer and presented ID, but the officer has him in custody anyway. This is happening right now, November 3rd, 2025. The raw intensity of her commentary resonated with viewers, who began sharing the stream across their own networks, exponentially increasing its reach. Within minutes, her stream had been clipped and reposted across multiple platforms, each new share adding to the growing digital wildfire. Across the waiting area, James Patterson had positioned himself for an optimal angle. His LinkedIn professional live stream and already connecting with his extensive network of corporate executives and legal professionals. Unlike the younger, more emotional TikTok audience, his viewers were responding with calculated professional outrage. This is a liability nightmare for that airport. Clear violation of established TSA protocols. If that's who I think it is, that officer just ended his career. Our firm handled a similar case last year. The settlement was in the millions. Patterson, a 37-year-old technology executive, framed his narration in corporate terms. I'm witnessing what appears to be a serious breach of professional security protocols and potential civil rights violations. The detained individual has conducted himself with remarkable poise, while the officer's behavior seems increasingly erratic and unprofessional. This is exactly the scenario our corporate security training explicitly warns against. The airport's digital infrastructure registered the anomaly immediately. Liberty International's social media monitoring system, designed to track passenger complaints and potential public relations issues, lit up with unprecedented activity. Automated alerts triggered at key thresholds. ALR tweet, security incident report, retweeted. Gate B12. Multiple live streams detected. Content tagged, hashtag PROFILING, hashtag RACIS minimum. Viewer count exceeding normal parameters. Immediate response advised. Media inquiry level, a critical. 7 news organizations requesting comment. Inside the Terminal Security and Operations Center, night shift social media coordinator Jamie Vasquez stared at his monitor in disbelief as the viewer counts continued climbing across platforms. His finger hovered over the critical incident button that would alert senior management. In 3 years on this job, he'd never pressed it. He pressed it now. Near the back of the waiting area, an elderly couple fumbled with their phones, asking a teenager to help them turn on the recording thing. A businessman dictated what he was witnessing into his Apple Watch, sending real-time updates to his legal team. A flight attendant waiting for her connecting flight surreptitiously filmed from an angle that captured both Peterson's badge number and Marcus's calm, dignified expression. The hashtags forming around the incident multiplied and cross-pollinated across platforms. Hashtag GateB12, 4,378 posts in 8 minutes. Hashtag Flying While Black, 12,953 shares and climbing. Hashtag Airport Justice. Trending number 3 in New York area. Hashtag Officer Peterson. Badge number now attached to name. Hashtag Witness Now. Civil rights organizations amplifying the airport's crisis management software track the digital spread with cold precision. Initial video gate B12, 3:47 p.m. First cross-platform share, 3:49 p.m. Media alert, 3:53 p.m. Celebrity amplification, 3:57 p.m. NBA. Player Damian Willis shares to 8.79 followers. Political attention 4. Oitupian State Senator Maria Lopez comments. Within 7 minutes of the handcuffs clicking shut, the first media outlet, a local New Jersey digital news site, posted a breaking news alert developing apparent racial profiling incident at Liberty Airport, streaming live. Within 3 more minutes, 3 national news organizations had picked up the story, embedding Sophia's TikTok feed into their breaking news tickers. The Liberty International Airport Public Affairs Office received its first media inquiry exactly 11 minutes after Peterson first approached Marcus. By 12 minutes, they had 7 more. The airport's crisis management protocol activated automatically when inquiries exceeded the 5 per incident threshold. In the administrative offices, Thomas Garcia, the 52-year-old airport director, was finishing a budget meeting when his phone lit up with a succession of urgent notifications. He excused himself, stepping into the hallway to call security operations. "How bad is it?" he asked without preamble. "Sir, we have multiple live streams from Gate B12 showing Officer Peterson detaining a passenger. Looks like a professional black male, handcuffed after presenting ID. Social media reaction is significant." "Define significant," Garcia pressed, already moving toward the elevators. "Combined viewer count across platforms just past 100,000 and accelerating. First news organizations are calling for comment. Officer Rodriguez has called for supervisory presence. And sir, we've just identified the detained passenger." "Who is he?" There was a brief pause on the line. "Sir, it appears to be Marcus Taylor." "Taylor," the name registered immediately. "As in Jonathan Taylor's son." "Yes, sir." Garcia closed his eyes briefly, feeling the beginnings of what promised to be a career-defining migraine. "I'm heading there now. Alert legal immediately. And for God's sake, get Peterson to stand down until I arrive." As he stepped into the elevator, Garcia didn't know that the most critical piece of information about Marcus Taylor was still working its way through the digital ecosystem, a piece of information that would transform this from a troubling incident into a career-ending catastrophe for everyone involved in Marcus's detention. The alert that would change everything was just hitting the phone of a legal secretary at Taylor & Associates Law Group in Manhattan, where Jonathan Taylor, Marcus's father and one of the most feared civil rights attorneys in America, was wrapping up a meeting with 3 federal judges. Meanwhile, at Gate B12, the digital documentation continued, creating an evidentiary record so comprehensive it would later be described by federal prosecutors as the most thoroughly documented civil rights violation in transportation security history. The phone call. "I want my phone call," Marcus stated, his voice level despite the handcuffs biting into his wrists. "Now," Peterson smirked, enjoying the power dynamic. "You'll get your call when processing is complete." "There is no processing to complete, Officer Peterson," Marcus replied. "I've committed no crime. I've presented identification. This detention is unlawful, and you know it." Marcus's Apple Watch had already sent automated alerts to his emergency contacts, a feature he'd activated after witnessing similar incidents happen to clients. The messages were moving through the digital system, but he needed to make an actual call. "Listen, lawyer," Peterson said, mockingly emphasizing the title. "You can quote regulations all day, but right now you're in my custody, and you'll follow my timeline." Rodriguez, standing slightly apart from her partner, looked increasingly uncomfortable. The supervisor should have arrived by now. The growing crowd of recording passengers made the situation more volatile by the second. "Officer Rodriguez," Marcus pivoted, addressing her directly. "You are witnessing a clear violation of TSA Directive 2023-7B regarding passenger rights during security interactions. As the secondary officer present, you have an affirmative duty to intervene when protocols are violated." Rodriguez blinked, surprised by his specific knowledge of transportation security regulations. "Sir, He doesn't need your help, Rodriguez." Peterson cut in. "He needs to shut his mouth and wait for transport." "Transport," Marcus repeated. "You intend to remove me from the terminal for a non-offense." Peterson stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Keep it up, and resisting turns into assaulting an officer. See how your lawyer job survives that charge." Marcus maintained eye contact, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm entitled to my phone call before any transport. That's federal regulation, not airport discretion." Something in his unwavering confidence finally penetrated Peterson's armor of authority. With visible reluctance, he reached into Marcus's jacket pocket and retrieved the phone. "One call, on speaker, any funny business, and this becomes evidence." "It already is evidence," Marcus replied calmly. "Just not in the way you think." Peterson held the phone up, his thumb hovering over the speaker button. "Who are you calling your public defender buddy?" A flicker of something, the first genuine emotion Marcus had allowed himself to show, crossed his face. I'm calling my father. Peterson rolled his eyes. Of course you are. Daddy going to come fix this for you. The phone connected, ringing twice before being answered. Marcus, I just got an alert from your watch. What's happening? The voice that emerged from the speaker was deep, authoritative, a baritone honed through decades of courtroom battles. Dad, I'm being detained at Liberty International Airport. Gate B12, Marcus stated clearly. Officer Richard Peterson has me handcuffed without probable cause after I presented identification. I'm currently being denied my rights under federal transportation regulations and the Fourth Amendment. There was the briefest pause on the line, just 2 seconds of silence that somehow felt loaded with significance. Is the officer present? Jonathan Taylor asked, his tone shifting subtly. Yes, sir. He's holding my phone on speaker. Officer Peterson, Jonathan began, his voice now carrying a precision that came from decades of deposing hostile witnesses. This is Jonathan Taylor of Taylor and Associates Law Group. I need you to understand something clearly. You have just handcuffed my son, a licensed attorney who has committed no crime, in a public space, on camera, in violation of at least 7 federal statutes I can name without opening a law book. Peterson's expression faltered slightly. The name Taylor was finally registering. Sir, your son was— I'm not finished, officer. Jonathan cut him off with practiced authority. What you do in the next 5 minutes will determine whether you're a defendant in federal court this week or next week. Those are your only options now. Peterson glanced around, suddenly aware of just how many recording devices were pointed at him. The confidence that had fueled his actions minutes ago was visibly draining from his face. Marcus, Jonathan continued, is Supervisor Garcia there yet? Marcus looked surprised. How did you know to ask for— Thomas Garcia and I have history, Jonathan explained. He was deposed in the Williams case last year. He knows exactly who I am and exactly what happens when my firm focuses on a civil rights violation. Rodriguez had stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. The significance of the situation was crystallizing for her in real time. Peterson still held the phone, but his hand had begun to tremble visibly. Now, Jonathan's voice filled the silent gate area. I want you to listen very carefully. Officer Peterson, I am currently in a meeting with 3 federal judges, including Judge Maria Hernandez, who oversees civil rights cases in your jurisdiction. I am going to step out of this meeting and make exactly 2 phone calls. The first will be to Airport Director Garcia's direct line. The second will be to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, where my former partner is now the Deputy Director. Peterson's face had drained of color, the gravity of his situation finally dawning on him. His swagger evaporated, replaced by the dawning horror of recognizing a career-ending mistake in real time. You have handcuffed the wrong person today. Officer Peterson, my son is not just any lawyer. He is a constitutional law specialist who has argued before the Supreme Court. He was on his way to Chicago to deliver the keynote address at the National Bar Association conference on proper police procedure. Someone in the crowd let out a low whistle. Sophia Williams whispered to her live stream viewers, "Oh my God, that officer is done." "Dad," Marcus interjected, "there are multiple witnesses recording, including Miss Vanessa Porter, who identified herself." "Excellent," Jonathan replied. "Miss Porter, if you can hear me, my office will be contacting you for your statement. To everyone recording, please maintain your distance for safety, but continue documenting. What you're witnessing is a textbook civil rights violation that will likely become case law." Peterson finally found his voice again, but it emerged shaky, stripped of its earlier authority. "Sir, there's been a misunderstanding. We received reports of suspicious—" "Save it for your deposition, officer." Jonathan cut him off. "The only thing that matters now is what you do next. Release my son immediately, return his belongings, and step back. That's the only action that might slightly mitigate what's coming." The terminal's PA system crackled. "Supervisor to gate B12. Supervisor to gate B12 immediately." That would be Garcia now, Jonathan noted. "Marcus, I'll be there in 45 minutes. The firm's legal team will be there in 30. Don't answer any questions without representation present." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied. maintaining his composure despite the vindication washing over him. "And Officer Peterson," Jonathan concluded, "I suggest you contact your union representative. You're going to need significant legal counsel." The call ended, leaving a profound silence in its wake. Peterson stood frozen, still holding Marcus's phone, the enormity of his mistake finally sinking in. He hadn't just detained a random black professional who wouldn't submit to intimidation. He had handcuffed Marcus Taylor, son of Jonathan Taylor, whose name was attached to 17 Supreme Court victories, whose firm had secured $2.8 billion in police misconduct settlements, whose personal phone number was saved in the contacts of 3 Supreme Court justices and the Attorney General. The phone in Peterson's hands suddenly seemed as heavy as his future. Rodriguez approached cautiously, her voice low. "Richard, we need to uncuff him. Now." Peterson didn't respond immediately, still processing the seismic shift in his circumstances. Around him, the passengers who had witnessed his confident abuse of authority minutes earlier now observed his unraveling with the same attention. "The keys, Richard," Rodriguez pressed, her hand extended. "Give me the keys." Peterson's fingers moved mechanically to his belt, retrieving the handcuff key. He passed it to Rodriguez without meeting her eyes, his movements wooden, automated. As Rodriguez moved to release Marcus, Peterson stared blankly at the floor, his mind racing through the implications. 14 years of service potentially ended by a 20-minute interaction. His mortgage, his pension, his identity, all suddenly precarious because he'd decided to assert his authority over the wrong passenger. "I was just following protocol," he muttered, though no one was listening anymore. He was suspicious, but the justification sounded hollow even to his own ears. The evidence was overwhelming, captured from multiple angles, witnessed by dozens, now viewed by hundreds of thousands. His career wasn't just in jeopardy, it was effectively over. And somewhere in Manhattan, Jonathan Taylor was already setting in motion the legal machinery that would transform Peterson's mistake into a landmark case study in the consequences of biased enforcement. Airport Administration response. Thomas Garcia moved through the terminal with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to crisis management. At 52, the airport director had weathered storms both literal and figurative during his 15-year tenure at Liberty International. Budget shortfalls, blizzards, security breaches, political scandals, all had tested his leadership, but nothing quite like the text message that had just flashed across his phone. Jonathan Taylor's son in cuffs at B12, live streaming, media alert tweeted. Garcia knew exactly who Jonathan Taylor was. The airport had been a defendant in a case Taylor's firm handled just last year, a racial discrimination suit that had cost them $4.7 million and led to a complete overhaul of their hiring practices. The settlement agreement still sat in Garcia's desk drawer, its terms a constant reminder of what happens when institutions fail to police themselves properly. "Get me the security footage from Gate B12 last 15 minutes, he instructed his assistant via phone as he power-walked through Terminal B. "And tell legal to prepare for possible action from Taylor and Associates." His assistant's voice came back tight with tension. "Sir, legal is already on it. They've received 3 media inquiries in the past 4 minutes. The footage doesn't look good." "Define doesn't look good," Garcia pressed, dodging a family with rolling luggage. Officer Peterson approached without clear cause, escalated without provocation, and proceeded to handcuff a passenger who had presented ID and was sitting quietly. Multiple recordings show Peterson using biased language. Garcia closed his eyes briefly, still walking. Who approved Peterson for passenger-facing duty? Wasn't he supposed to be on administrative assignment after the Henderson complaint last month? Staffing shortage in Terminal B this morning. Shift supervisor Ramirez moved him back to gate duty temporarily. "Find Ramirez, now." Garcia ended the call as he rounded the corner to gate B12, immediately taking in the scene Officer Peterson standing rigidly, still holding Marcus's phone, Officer Rodriguez several steps away, looking distressed, and Marcus Taylor, handcuffed but composed, surrounded by a circle of passengers with recording devices. Garcia had managed enough incidents to recognize the difference between a problem and a catastrophe. This was firmly in catastrophe territory. "Officer Peterson," he called out with calm authority. "Step away from Mr. Taylor immediately." Peterson turned, relief briefly flickering across his face at the appearance of his superior, quickly replaced by uncertainty as he registered Garcia's expression. "Sir, this individual was exhibiting suspicious—" "Step away! Now!" Garcia's voice left no room for discussion. "Officer Rodriguez, please remove those handcuffs immediately." Rodriguez moved forward quickly, grateful for the clear directive. As she unlocked the cuffs, Garcia approached Marcus directly. "Mr. Taylor, I'm Thomas Garcia, Airport Director, on behalf of Liberty International Airport. I want to express my profound regret for this incident. We will be conducting a full investigation, and I assure you that appropriate action will be taken." Marcus rubbed his wrist where the cuffs had dug in, his expression measured. "Mr. Garcia, I believe you know my father." "I do," Garcia acknowledged, keeping his voice even, despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "Jonathan Taylor is a respected attorney with whom this airport has had previous interactions." "Then you understand the seriousness of what's occurred here." "I do," Garcia repeated, "and I would like to offer you a private space where we can discuss this matter further, away from the terminal." Marcus glanced around at the recording passengers, then back to Garcia. "I appreciate the offer, but I'll wait here until my legal team arrives. My father's on his way as well." Garcia nodded, having expected this response. "Of course, may I at least ensure that your belongings are returned to you properly?" While this exchange occurred, Peterson had backed away, his face a mask of dawning horror. The name Taylor had finally registered fully, and with it, the magnitude of his miscalculation. He leaned toward Rodriguez, whispering urgently, Did you know who he was?" Rodriguez shook her head slightly, still focused on the scene before her. "I tried to tell you to wait, to verify. You wouldn't listen. You never listen." The last three words carried the weight of months of frustration, a junior officer repeatedly attempting to guide her senior partner toward better practices, only to be dismissed. In the airport's Security Operations Center, analysts were reviewing the footage from Gate B12, mapping it against established protocols. The violations were being logged in real time. Approach without established cause. Protocol violation section A7. Failure to identify officer purpose. Protocol violation section B3. Escalation without provocation. Protocol violation section C5. Use of biased language. Policy violation. HR 117. Unlawful detention. Legal violation. Fourth Amendment. Improper search of personal belongings. Protocol violation section D9. Failure to follow supervisory directive from Rodriguez. Protocol violation section A12. Garcia's phone buzzed again. A text from the airport's chief legal counsel. Media requests now at 17, CNN, Fox, MSNBC, all asking for statement. Taylor and Associates has requested all footage be preserved. DOJ Civil Rights Division calling. Garcia kept his expression neutral as he turned back to the situation at hand. "Officer Peterson, report to my office immediately. Officer Rodriguez, please remain with Mr. Taylor and ensure he has everything he needs." Peterson hesitated, sweat beading visibly on his forehead. "Sir, my shift isn't over for another." "That wasn't a suggestion." "Officer Peterson, my office now." Garcia's tone left no room for misinterpretation. As Peterson reluctantly departed, his shoulders slumped in defeated recognition of what awaited him. Garcia addressed the crowd of onlookers, his crisis management training kicking in. "Ladies and gentlemen, the situation is under control. If you were a witness to this incident and wish to provide a statement, airport staff will be available to take your information. Otherwise, we ask that you please give Taylor some space." Most passengers remained in place, phones still recording. The story was too compelling to walk away from now. Some had already been contacted by news organizations requesting permission to use their footage. Garcia turned back to Marcus. "Mr. Taylor, is there anything we can provide for you while you wait water?" Perhaps. Marcus straightened his blazer, his composure remarkable given the circumstances. "I'd like my boarding pass reissued. Please, I still intend to make my flight to Chicago." "Of course," Garcia replied, gesturing to the gate agent. "Frank will take care of that immediately, and I want to assure you that we take this matter extremely seriously. Officer Peterson's actions do not reflect the policies or values of Liberty International Airport." Marcus regarded him steadily. "Mr. Garcia, with respect, what happened here isn't an isolated incident. It's a systemic problem that requires systemic solutions. I suspect you'll be hearing more about that from my father's firm in the coming days. Garcia nodded, recognizing the implicit warning. I understand, and we are committed to addressing any systemic issues within our security protocols. As they spoke, Vanessa Porter approached, her phone still in hand but no longer recording. Mr. Taylor, I've sent the video to the email address your father provided. I want you to know that I'm prepared to testify about what I witnessed here today. Thank you, Ms. Porter, Marcus replied. Your willingness to speak up made a difference. The digital wildfire continued to spread beyond the confines of Gate B12. Sophia Williams's TikTok live stream had surpassed 200,000 viewers. James Patterson's LinkedIn broadcast had been shared by 3 major civil rights organizations and 2 law school deans. The first national news crews were already en route to Liberty International. In the executive offices, Peterson was about to face the first of many uncomfortable conversations that would ultimately end his career. And in a car speeding from Manhattan to New Jersey, Jonathan Taylor was already dictating the framework of what would become one of the most significant civil rights cases in airport security history. The wheels of justice, usually slow to turn, had been accelerated by digital documentation and the power of a name that carried weight in federal courtrooms across America. Federal involvement, while the drama at Gate B12 continued to unfold, a series of high-level phone calls were already setting larger wheels in motion. In a glass-walled office on the 5th floor of the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C., Deputy Director Gabriela Morales of the Civil Rights Division was midway through her second cup of afternoon coffee when her secure line rang. Morales, she answered crisply. Gabby, it's Jonathan Taylor. The voice was instantly recognizable, her former Harvard law classmate, occasional tennis opponent, and one of the most respected civil rights attorneys in the country. Jonathan, she replied, her tone warming slightly. It's been a minute. My son Marcus has just been handcuffed at Liberty International Airport without cause. He interrupted, his voice controlled but urgent. It's being live-streamed across multiple platforms right now. Clear racial profiling, officer misconduct, the works. Morales set down her coffee, instantly shifting into professional mode. Is he okay? Physically, yes. The situation is still active. Airport Director Garcia is on scene now. Tell me exactly what happened, she said, already reaching for her tablet to pull up the department's incident response protocols. As Jonathan provided a concise summary of events, Morales' fingers flew across her screen, pulling up the DOJ's Civil Rights Enforcement database. Liberty International Airport appeared immediately. 3 previous investigations in the past 5 years, one resulting in a consent decree that should have mandated improved training and accountability measures. The officer's name is Richard Peterson, she confirmed, entering it into the federal database. That's correct. Badge number 4471. Morales frowned at her screen. We've got prior flags on him. Jonathan, 2 civilian complaints filed with our office in the last 18 months, both involving alleged profiling of minority passengers. Neither reached the threshold for federal action as standalone incidents, but this changes the pattern analysis. I need you to open a preliminary investigation, Jonathan said. I want his personnel file secured before anything disappears. Already on it, Morales assured him. I'm sending electronic preservation notices to Liberty International's records department as we speak, and I'll have a team from our Newark field office en route within 30 minutes. She paused, her expression growing more serious as new information populated her screen. Jonathan, Peterson has 11 excessive force complaints in his file. All but 2 were dismissed by internal review. This guy should never have been in a passenger-facing position. That's exactly the systemic failure we need to address, Jonathan replied. This goes beyond one rogue officer. Agreed, I'm escalating this to priority status. Her fingers continued moving across her tablet. I'm also seeing that Liberty International is still under a 2023 consent agreement following the Williams discrimination suit. Your firm handled that, right? We did. $4.7 million settlement and mandated reforms to their security protocols. Reforms that clearly haven't been properly implemented if Peterson is still harassing passengers. Morales nodded to herself. That gives us additional leverage. Violation of a federal consent decree opens up a whole new avenue for departmental intervention. As they spoke, her email notifications began pinging rapidly. Media inquiries, internal alerts from the DOJ's social media monitoring team, and a direct message from the Attorney General's office asking for a briefing on the situation. This is gaining traction fast. Jonathan, I'm seeing alerts from all major networks. Good, he replied firmly. I want every bit of pressure possible on Liberty International. This isn't just about Marcus, it's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else. Morales understood completely. As a Hispanic woman who had risen through the ranks of federal law enforcement, she had witnessed firsthand how institutions could perpetuate discriminatory practices despite official policies to the contrary. I'll handle the federal side, she assured him. We'll get Peterson's text messages, emails, performance reviews, everything. If there's a pattern of bias, we'll find it. Thank you, Gabby. Marcus's legal team is already en route to the airport. I'm about 20 minutes behind them. Keep me posted, she said. And Jonathan, give Marcus my best. Tell him we've got his back. After ending the call, Morales immediately pressed the intercom button on her desk. Sandra, I need the Liberty International Airport case file from 2023, the Peterson complaints from our database, and a conference call with the Newark field office team in 5 minutes. We're initiating a priority civil rights investigation. She then turned to her computer, drafting a formal notification to Liberty International's legal department, Federal Investigation Civil Rights Violation at Liberty International Airport, pursuant to Title 42, U.S.C. 1983, and the authority vested in the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division. This letter serves as official notification of a federal investigation into alleged civil rights violations occurring on November 3, 2025 involving Officer Richard Peterson, badge number 4471, and passenger Marcus Taylor. Effective immediately, Liberty International Airport is directed to preserve all evidence related to this incident, including but not limited to all security camera footage from Terminal B for November 3, 2025, Officer Peterson's complete personnel file, all communications email, text, radio from Officer Peterson. For the past 30 days, all internal reviews of Officer Peterson's conduct during his employment, all training records related to anti-bias procedures and passenger interaction protocols. Federal investigators will arrive at Liberty International Airport within the hour. Full cooperation is expected and required under the terms of the 2023 Consent Decree currently in effect. Gabriela Morales, Deputy Director, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice. As she sent the notification, alerts continued flooding her screen. The incident was spreading across social media platforms at an unprecedented rate. The video had already been viewed by over 500,000 people, with commentary from legal experts, civil rights leaders, and ordinary citizens expressing outrage at Peterson's conduct. Morales' phone rang again. It was the Attorney General himself. I'm seeing the Liberty Airport situation, he said without preamble. Where are we? Full response activated. Morales replied, I've initiated a priority investigation, preservation orders sent, and field team deploying. Jonathan Taylor's involved. It's his son who was detained. Jonathan Taylor, the AG repeated, understanding the significance. The officer had no idea who he was handcuffing. Did he? Some? Apparently not. And the whole thing's on multiple videos, crystal clear violations. It's textbook. Keep me updated personally on this one, the AG instructed. If it's as bad as it looks, we may need to use this case to send a message about transportation security practices nationwide. Yes, sir. As Morales hung up, she pulled up one of the live stream videos on her tablet. The footage was damning, Peterson's bias evident in both his words and actions, the constitutional violations unmistakable even to a first-year law student. What struck her most, however, was Marcus Taylor's composure throughout the ordeal. Even handcuffed, even publicly humiliated, he maintained the dignified bearing of someone who understood exactly how to transform an individual injustice into systemic change. Like father, like son. The case had all the elements to become a landmark in transportation security reform, clear video evidence, a victim with impeccable credentials, multiple witnesses, and a documented history of similar incidents. The perfect storm for meaningful change. Within the hour, a full DOJ investigative team would be on site at Liberty International, prepared to begin what promised to be one of the most high-profile civil rights investigations of the year. And Peterson, who had started his day as an ordinary airport security officer, would end it as the subject of federal scrutiny that would ultimately reshape airport security protocols nationwide. The release. Remove those handcuffs. Now. Garcia's directive cut through the tense atmosphere at Gate B12. Officer Rodriguez quickly stepped forward, keys already in hand. As she unlocked the restraints, Marcus maintained his dignified composure, neither flinching nor showing relief. His expression remained that of a professional documenting every moment of the encounter for future reference. "Mr. Taylor," Garcia continued, his tone shifting to one of formal contrition. "On behalf of Liberty International Airport, I want to express our sincere apologies for this incident. There is no excuse for what happened here today." The metal handcuffs finally fell away, leaving angry red marks on Marcus's wrists. He rotated his hands slowly, restoring circulation while mentally cataloging the physical evidence of his detention. The marks would be photographed later by the legal team, visible proof of the excessive force that had been applied. "Apologies are appropriate, Mr. Garcia," Marcus replied evenly. "But they're just the beginning of what needs to happen here." Garcia nodded, fully aware of the legal tsunami forming on his horizon. "I understand. We will be conducting a complete investigation into Officer Peterson's actions and the supervisory failures that allowed this to occur." Vanessa Porter stepped closer, her corporate executive presence adding another layer of gravitas to the scene. "Mr. Garcia, as someone who witnessed this entire incident, I can confirm that there was absolutely no justification for Mr. Taylor's detention. This was textbook profiling, and the officer's language made his biases quite clear." "Thank you, Ms. Porter," Garcia acknowledged. "We will absolutely want your statement as part of our investigation." Marcus straightened his blazer and adjusted his cuffs, reclaiming his professional appearance bit by bit. The small act of grooming served both practical and psychological purposes, restoring his dignity in front of the same audience that had witnessed his humiliation. "Mr. Garcia, where is Officer Peterson now?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. "He has been removed from duty and instructed to report to my office immediately," Garcia explained. "He will be placed on administrative leave pending investigation." "Administrative leave," Marcus repeated, a hint of weariness in his voice. "With pay, I assume?" Garcia hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Initially, yes. That's standard procedure until the investigation confirms what everyone with a phone just witnessed." Marcus completed the thought. "Mr. Garcia, this isn't just about one officer. This is about systems that enable and protect such behavior. My detention today is symptomatic of much deeper institutional failures." The gate area remained unusually silent, passengers still recording, still watching the aftermath unfold with rapt attention. Nearby, Frank the gate agent was reprinting Marcus's boarding pass, his hands slightly unsteady from the tension of the past 20 minutes. "Your belongings, sir," Rodriguez said quietly, handing over Marcus's leather duffel bag and his portfolio, which Peterson had carelessly tossed aside during his impromptu search. Marcus accepted them with a nod. "Thank you, Officer Rodriguez." Rodriguez hesitated, then spoke in a low voice. "I want you to know I tried to de-escalate. I should have tried harder. I'm sorry." Marcus regarded her thoughtfully. "The blue wall of silence is a powerful institutional force. Officer Rodriguez, breaking through it requires more than good intentions. It requires courage." Rodriguez absorbed his words, her expression suggesting they had found their mark. In the background, the gate's PA system crackled to life. "Attention passengers for Flight 447 to Chicago O'Hare. We will begin boarding in approximately 15 minutes. We apologize for the delay." Garcia glanced at the announcement board, then back to Marcus. "Mr. Taylor, would you prefer to take a later flight? We can arrange private lounge access while you wait for your father and legal team." Marcus shook his head. "No, I'm going to Chicago as planned. I have a keynote address to deliver tomorrow morning on constitutional protections in law enforcement encounters. Today's experience has provided some additional material." A hint of uncomfortable recognition crossed Garcia's face. "Of course. Whatever you prefer." "What I prefer," Marcus replied, his voice gaining strength, "is for Liberty International Airport to become an example of meaningful reform rather than another case study in institutional resistance to change. That choice is largely in your hands. Mr. Garcia." Before the airport director could respond, a commotion at the terminal entrance drew everyone's attention. Four individuals in crisp suits moved purposefully toward Gate B12, carrying leather briefcases and expressions of professional determination. The lead attorney, a tall woman with close-cropped silver hair, scanned the crowd and locked eyes with Marcus. Taylor and Associates, legal team, Sophia Williams whispered into her still-active live stream. This is getting real, y'all. Marcus stepped forward to meet the approaching attorneys. Angela, he greeted the lead counsel. That was fast. We were in court in Newark when your father called, she explained. Marcus, are you all right? I'm fine, he assured her, though the red marks on his wrist told a different story. Mr. Garcia has just been explaining Liberty International's commitment to a thorough investigation. Angela Winters, senior partner at Taylor and Associates and veteran of dozens of high-profile civil rights cases, turned her attention to the airport director. Mr. Garcia, I believe we've met before. The Williams settlement last year. Garcia nodded, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the increasingly problematic situation. Yes, Ms. Winters, I remember. Then you'll recall the terms of that settlement included comprehensive reforms to your security protocols, specifically regarding biased enforcement patterns. I do. Excellent, Angela replied with razor-sharp pleasantness. Then you'll understand when I tell you that the Department of Justice has already been notified of this incident, and federal investigators are en route. Given that today's events appear to constitute a violation of your existing consent decree, this situation has implications well beyond a single unfortunate encounter. Garcia's complexion paled slightly, but he maintained his composure. We are prepared to cooperate fully with any investigation. As this exchange unfolded, Marcus stepped slightly away, taking a moment to center himself. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was beginning to ebb, leaving in its wake a familiar emotional cocktail, anger at the injustice, disappointment that such incidents still occurred with regularity, and determination to transform his personal experience into systemic change. His phone buzzed with a text from his father. 10 minutes out, DOJ team dispatched. Stay strong. Marcus took a deep breath. Looking around at the gate area, the passengers who had witnessed his humiliation now watched his restoration with equal interest. Their phones remained out, still recording, still documenting. In the age of ubiquitous cameras, justice had gained powerful new allies. Mr. Taylor, Frank called tentatively, holding out a freshly printed boarding pass. Your first-class seat has been reissued, and the airline has upgraded you to priority boarding. Marcus accepted the document with a nod of acknowledgement. Thank you. As he tucked the boarding pass into his jacket pocket, he caught sight of Rodriguez watching him from a few yards away. Their eyes met briefly, hers troubled, his resolute. In that moment of silent communication, both recognized a truth about the system they operated within from the inside as an officer constrained by institutional loyalties. He from the outside as an attorney committed to reform. The first reporters were arriving now, setting up camera equipment just outside the security perimeter. Marcus knew the questions would soon begin, the same questions he had answered for clients in similar situations. This time, the story was his own. He straightened his shoulders, preparing to transform a personal indignity into a platform for change. Peterson had made a critical error today, not just in choosing to harass a black attorney, but in choosing to harass the son of Jonathan Taylor, a man whose life's work had been dismantling precisely the kind of systemic discrimination that Peterson embodied. As Marcus waited for his father's arrival and his eventual flight to Chicago, one thought crystallized in his mind. What had happened to him today happened to countless others without cameras, without famous fathers, without law degrees. Their stories rarely made headlines or sparked federal investigations. That would be the focus of his keynote address tomorrow. He decided, not just his experience, but the thousands of similar encounters that occurred daily across America without resolution or remedy. Peterson had unwittingly provided him with the perfect case study. Public reaction intensifies. By 5:30 p.m., just under 2 hours after Richard Peterson first approached Marcus Taylor, the incident at Gate B12 had transcended the boundaries of a local airport disturbance to become a national flashpoint in the ongoing conversation about race, authority, and accountability in America. CNN's breaking news chyron read, Black attorney handcuffed at Libre tweet, airport tweet, father is prominent civil rights lawyer. Fox News countered with, airport tweet security incident sparks controversy, officer on leave. MSNBC went directly to racial profiling caught on camera. DOJ launches investigation. Social media metrics told an even more dramatic story. Sophia Williams' original TikTok livestream had been viewed 1.2 million times and generated over 300,000 comments. Justice for all. This is America in 2025. Nothing's changed. For to law student 2025. I'm studying this case in my civil rights class next semester, flying tomorrow. Cancel my flight through Liberty. Not risking this treatment. Security vet. As former TSA, I can confirm this violated at least 7 protocols. Whiteley 486. I was at the gate. It was worse in person. The officer's tone was pure contempt. Twitter, now known as X Analytics, showed hashtag GateB12 trending nationally alongside hashtag justice for Marcus Taylor and hashtag airport. While black, the latter hashtag had connected Marcus's experience to a broader pattern, with thousands of users sharing their own stories of discrimination in transportation settings. Inside the Liberty International Airport administrative offices, the crisis management team had assembled in the main conference room. Public Affairs Director Rachel Kim stared grimly at the social media dashboard displayed on the wall-mounted screen. The numbers are unprecedented, she reported to the assembled executives. We've had security incidents before, but nothing with this level of public engagement. The original videos have been shared by multiple celebrities and political figures. We've received press inquiries from 37 news organizations, including international outlets. Thomas Garcia rubbed his temples, feeling the full weight of the situation bearing down on the airport's reputation and his career. What are we looking at in terms of financial exposure? The chief legal counsel, Daniel Friedman, cleared his throat. Worst case given the Taylor firm's track record, the violation of our existing consent decree, and the clear video evidence, we could be looking at 8 figures, plus mandatory structural reforms far more extensive than what we agreed to in the Williams settlement. A heavy silence fell over the room. The initial statement is ready for your approval, Rachel continued, sliding a tablet toward Garcia. It emphasizes our commitment to a thorough investigation, immediate action regarding Officer Peterson, and our dedication to unbiased security procedures. Garcia scanned the carefully crafted corporate language, recognizing the hollow ring of promises they had made and broken before burn. It's not enough, he said finally, pushing the tablet back. Standard PR language isn't going to cut it this time. We need to acknowledge that what happened today represents a fundamental failure of our systems, not just one officer's poor judgment. Rachel looked surprised. That's unusually forthright for an official statement during an active investigation. This isn't a usual situation, Garcia replied, standing up and pacing the room. I was there. I saw the video. There's no ambiguity here. Peterson was completely out of line, and our supervisory protocols failed to prevent it. And now we're facing Jonathan Taylor and the DOJ simultaneously. He moved to the window that overlooked the busy terminal below. Draft something that actually takes responsibility. Acknowledge that we've fallen short of the standards we committed to after the Williams settlement. State clearly that Officer Peterson has been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending termination proceedings. Unpaid, Daniel interjected. The union will buy so well. I don't care what the union will do. Garcia cut him off. I just watched an officer under my authority handcuff a man for sitting quietly at a gate. The evidence is clear and overwhelming. We're not hiding behind process this time. Outside the conference room, the regular operations of the airport continued, planes landing and departing, passengers rushing to make connections, baggage carousels turning. But within the terminal, a different energy had taken hold. At security checkpoints, officers found themselves under increased scrutiny, passengers openly recording routine interactions. At Gate B12 Airport, staff had erected temporary barriers to accommodate the growing media presence while maintaining access for travelers. In Washington, D.C., the incident had reached the highest levels of government. The Secretary of Transportation had requested a briefing. The Congressional Black Caucus had issued a statement calling for a comprehensive review of airport security practices nationwide. 3 civil rights organizations had announced plans for demonstrations at major airports across the country. Marcus Taylor, meanwhile, had boarded his flight to Chicago as planned. Before takeoff, he'd provided a brief statement to the assembled press. What happened to me today is not unique or unusual. It happens to countless Americans who don't have law degrees or famous fathers or viral videos. The only unusual aspect is that this time, there may actually be meaningful consequences. My hope is that Liberty International Airport will embrace this opportunity for genuine reform rather than performative apologies. The measure of justice will not be what happens to Officer Peterson, but what happens to the system that empowered him. As Flight 447 taxied toward the runway, Marcus closed his eyes, finally allowing himself a moment of quiet reflection. His phone had been inundated with messages, colleagues expressing support, media requesting interviews, civil rights organizations seeking his involvement in broader advocacy efforts. Tomorrow's keynote speech would need significant revisions. What had been planned as an academic discussion of constitutional principles would now be informed by lived experience. Theory had collided with reality at Gate B12, and Marcus found himself uniquely positioned to translate that collision into meaningful discourse. Back at the airport, Richard Peterson sat alone in a small conference room, awaiting his meeting with Director Garcia. His union representative had been called but hadn't arrived yet. His phone continued buzzing with notifications, colleagues, media, and increasingly, online threats as his name and badge number circulated across social media platforms. The security footage from Gate B12 had been reviewed by Internal Affairs and deemed deeply concerning. The preliminary report noted multiple protocol violations and clear indications of biased enforcement. Peterson's personnel file had been pulled, revealing a pattern that should have triggered intervention long before today's incident. 11 excessive force complaints, predominantly involving minority passengers, most dismissed with minimal review. Officer Rodriguez had provided her statement, acknowledging her failure to intervene more decisively while confirming that Marcus had presented proper identification and complied with all reasonable requests. Her account directly contradicted Peterson's initial justification for the detention. As the evening news cycles prepared to broadcast the story nationwide, the incident at Gate B12 was already being framed as a case study in both what goes wrong in law enforcement interactions and what can go right when accountability mechanisms function properly. Jonathan Taylor's involvement had accelerated processes that typically moved with glacial slowness. The Department of Justice's immediate response signaled an unusual level of federal interest. What Peterson had dismissed as a routine exercise of authority had transformed into a potential landmark case that could reshape transportation security protocols across the country. And at the center of it all was Marcus Taylor, a constitutional law expert who had experienced firsthand the gap between America's legal principles and their practical application. The plane lifted off from Liberty International Airport, carrying Marcus toward Chicago and a speaking engagement that had taken on dimensions he never anticipated. Below, the airport continued its normal operations, but the ripples from Gate B12 were only beginning to spread. Parrot Wheat 3, the investigation, in the tastefully appointed conference room of Taylor & Associates Law Group, 24 hours after the incident at Gate B12, a team of attorneys, paralegals, and digital evidence specialists gathered around a massive oval table. The wall-mounted screens displayed multiple angles of Marcus's detention, security footage obtained through emergency court order, passenger videos collected from social media, and enhanced audio recordings processed to isolate key exchanges. Jonathan Taylor stood at the head of the table, his imposing 6'3" frame silhouetted against the Manhattan skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows. At 63, he remained an intimidating presence in any room, his closely cropped silver hair and penetrating dark eyes reflecting decades of hard-fought civil rights battles in courtrooms across America. "What we're building here isn't just a case for Marcus," he explained to the assembled team. "We're constructing a comprehensive challenge to the entire security apparatus at Liberty International and potentially creating a template for reform at airports nationwide." Angela Winters, who had been among the first attorneys to reach Marcus at the airport, nodded in agreement. "We've identified 7 distinct federal violations in the initial detention alone. The Fourth Amendment issues are textbook. The pattern of selective enforcement is statistically irrefutable when compared to Liberty's own demographic data." She brought up a series of charts on one of the screens. According to their own internal reports, which we obtained through discovery in the Williams case, Black passengers represent 17% of Liberty International's traffic but account for 64% of extended security detentions. Hispanic passengers represent 19% of traffic, but 52% of secondary screenings. Jonathan turned to Derek Mitchell, the firm's digital evidence specialist. What's our social media situation? Mitchell pulled up a complex dashboard on the main screen. Unprecedented reach. We've identified 147 distinct videos captured by witnesses, ranging in length from 30 seconds to the full 22-minute interaction. Combined viewership across platforms exceeds 15 million. We've secured preservation notices for all original content and established a secure chain of custody for evidentiary purposes. The testimonials are equally compelling, added Sofia Gonzalez. The paralegal coordinating witness statements. We've already obtained formal declarations from 23 passengers who witnessed the entire encounter, including Vanessa Porter, whose corporate credentials add significant weight to her observations regarding Officer Peterson's biased language. Jonathan moved to the timeline displayed on another screen, examining the meticulous reconstruction of events. Every second of Marcus's detention had been analyzed, every word transcribed, every facial expression noted. The timeline had been color-coded to indicate specific violations of protocol, policy, and constitutional rights. What about Peterson's history, he asked, turning to Michael Wilson, who headed the background investigation team. His personnel file is a red flag factory, Wilson reported, scrolling through documents on his tablet. 11 excessive force complaints over 14 years, 9 involving minority passengers, 2 formal reprimands for unprofessional language that supervisors somehow didn't classify as discriminatory despite clear racial components, 4 citizen complaints filed directly with the DOJ that never resulted in disciplinary action. And yet he remained in a passenger-facing role, Jonathan observed, his tone measured but carrying undercurrents of controlled anger. That's where we find the systemic failures. Angela interjected. Liberty's own policies, revised after the Williams settlement, explicitly required that any officer with more than 3 excessive force complaints be reassigned to non-public positions pending comprehensive retraining. Peterson should have been removed from passenger contact at least 3 years ago. Jonathan nodded, processing the information. So we have both individual misconduct and institutional failure to enforce their own policies. What about Rodriguez? More complicated, Wilson admitted. Clean record, generally positive performance evaluations. Her body camera footage shows several attempts to de-escalate, though none forceful enough to actually stop Peterson. She's expressed willingness to cooperate fully with investigators. She'll be a valuable witness, Jonathan decided. Her testimony about the culture within Liberty's security force could be crucial to establishing the pattern and practice aspects of our case. The conference room door opened, and a young assistant entered, approaching Jonathan with urgency. Sir, we just received a data package from the DOJ. Deputy Director Morales expedited the federal records request. Jonathan accepted the encrypted tablet, entering his security credentials to access the files. As he scrolled through the newly available information, his expression darkened. Peterson's text messages, he announced to the room. The DOJ forensic team extracted communications from his department phone, multiple exchanges with other officers using explicitly racist language, specific references to profiling practices, even jokes about targeting well-dressed minority passengers to, quote, knock them down a peg. He displayed one particularly damning exchange on the main screen. Peterson got another fancy one at B12, expensive suit, acting like he owns the place. Officer Miller, better remind him who really runs this airport. Peterson, about to give him the VIP treatment, extra thorough search. Officer Miller, post pics if he gets mouthy, those ones always do. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This isn't just about Marcus anymore, Jonathan continued. These messages implicate at least 5 other officers in what appears to be a systematic practice of discriminatory enforcement. Gabriella's team has already flagged this for potential criminal civil rights charges. Angela Winters let out a low whistle. That elevates this well beyond a civil case. Exactly, Jonathan agreed. We're now looking at potential federal prosecution under 18 C 242 for deprivation of rights under color of law. Peterson's actions weren't just biased policing, they were potentially criminal. He turned to the assembled team, his expression resolute. I want every communication Peterson had with other officers for the past 5 years. I want performance reviews for every supervisor who received complaints about him and failed to act. I want demographic data on every passenger detained at Liberty International for the past decade. cross-referenced against security threats actually identified. The team nodded, already making notes and planning research assignments. This incident happened to Marcus, Jonathan concluded, but our response will be on behalf of everyone who has faced similar treatment without the resources to fight back. We have an opportunity here to create lasting structural change. As the meeting continued, Marcus's face appeared on one of the screens, a live feed from Chicago where he was preparing to deliver his keynote address to the National Bar Association conference. The speech had been entirely rewritten overnight to incorporate his personal experience at Gate B12, transforming an academic discussion into a powerful first-hand account of constitutional principles in peril. In the conference room in Manhattan, his father watched with evident pride as Marcus took the podium, the red marks from the handcuffs still visible on his wrists as he raised his hands to acknowledge the standing ovation that greeted him. The machinery of justice was now fully engaged, evidence gathered, witnesses secured, legal strategies formulated. What had begun as one officer's impulsive act of discrimination had expanded into an investigation with implications for airport security protocols nationwide. And at the center of it all remained the fundamental question that would drive both the legal proceedings and the public discourse in America's transportation hubs. Who is protected? Who is suspected? And who decides the difference? Peterson's perspective. Richard Peterson sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the untouched beer before him. The blinds were drawn against the early evening light, casting the modest New Jersey suburban home into shadows that matched his mood. His uniform hung in the closet, perhaps for the last time, and the silence in the house felt oppressive. Susan, his wife of 17 years, moved cautiously around the kitchen, preparing a dinner neither of them had the appetite to eat. The tension between them had been building since he'd arrived home from the most humiliating day of his professional life. "They've suspended me without pay," he finally said, breaking the silence. Garcia didn't even wait for the union rep to arrive. Said the evidence was overwhelming and indefensible. Susan paused her mechanical chopping of vegetables. "Rich, when I saw the video," Peterson's head snapped up. "What video? Where?" "It's everywhere, Richard, all over Facebook, Twitter, the news." She set down the knife. "My sister called from Florida asking if that was you. My boss sent me home early when someone recognized our name. The kid's teacher called to check if everything was okay at home." The reality of his new public identity began to sink in. He wasn't just Officer Peterson facing administrative discipline anymore. He was that officer from the viral video, the face of everything wrong with authority in America. "They're making it something it wasn't," he insisted, his voice rising defensively. "You don't understand what we deal with every day. The threats, the constant pressure. One mistake and people could die." "Was he threatening anyone, Rich?" Susan asked quietly. "The man in the video, was he doing anything that looked remotely dangerous?" Peterson's silence was answer enough. "He was just sitting there," she continued, her voice strained, "reading something on his tablet, and you just..." She stopped, unable to find words that wouldn't escalate the tension. "I was doing my job," Peterson insisted, though the conviction in his voice had hollowed. "Suspicious behavior takes different forms. Sometimes it's the quiet ones you need to watch. You think terrorists walk around with signs." Susan's patience finally broke. "Stop it. Just stop. I watched that entire video. Richard, there was nothing suspicious about that man except the color of his skin, and we both know it." The harsh truth hung in the air between them. In 17 years of marriage, Susan had absorbed Peterson's gradually darkening worldview without directly challenging it. The dinner table complaints about political correctness in training, the muttered comments about certain neighborhoods, the growing resentment toward a society he felt no longer respected authority. She had let it all pass in the name of marital harmony. But seeing her husband on video, watching his contempt for Marcus Taylor play out in high definition for millions to witness, had shattered something fundamental in their relationship. "You have no idea what this job does to you," Peterson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Day after day, dealing with the worst people, the constant threats, everyone with an attitude, everyone with a phone ready to make you the next viral villain." That man was a lawyer, Rich, a Harvard-educated attorney just trying to catch a flight. "I didn't know that when..." "You didn't care to know," Susan cut him off. "That's the problem. You didn't see a person worth knowing anything about. You saw a target. Peterson's phone buzzed again, the 17th call from a number he didn't recognize. The harassment had started within hours of the video going viral. Death threats on his voicemail, emails containing his home address shared in online forums. The police department had advised the family to stay inside and was providing occasional patrols past their house. The union lawyer says I need to lay low, Peterson said, ignoring the buzzing phone. No statements to anyone. They're working on a strategy. But with the DOJ involved, he trailed off, the magnitude of his situation overwhelming him anew. Susan leaned against the counter, suddenly looking exhausted. What happens now? Best case, I lose my job. We fight it through the union. Maybe get a settlement to go away quietly. He took a long swallow of beer. Worst case, federal charges. They're talking about pattern and practice. Civil rights violations. Criminal charges. Criminal charges, Susan repeated, her voice faint. You could go to prison for this, Peterson nodded grimly. If they can prove a pattern of intentional rights violations, and apparently they're going through all my text messages from my work phone. Susan's expression changed, a new worry crossing her features. What would they find? Richard? He didn't answer immediately, his mind racing through years of casual messages with colleagues, the jokes, the comments, the things said in the heat of frustration or in the false privacy of conversations with trusted coworkers. The us versus them mentality that had gradually crept into his professional identity, hardening over the years into something he barely recognized anymore. Nothing criminal, he finally replied, but his tone lacked conviction. His phone buzzed again, this time displaying his union representative's name. Peterson snatched it up, desperate for any good news. Mike, tell me something positive, he said by way of greeting. The voice on the other end was grim. Rich, we've got problems. Big ones. The airport just released your text messages to the oversight committee. They're bad, man, really bad. The racial language, the profiling jokes, it's all out there now. Peterson felt the blood drain from his face. They can't do that. Those were private communications. On your department-issued phone, Mike corrected him. The user agreement you signed explicitly states all communications are subject to review. And with the federal investigation, they had no choice but to comply with the records request. Susan watched her husband's expression collapse, reading the devastating news in the slump of his shoulders. What are we looking at now? Peterson asked, his voice barely audible. I'm going to be straight with you. Rich, the union will provide representation as required by our obligations. But given the evidence, your best bet is to start negotiating a plea agreement. The department wants to make an example of you. The airport wants to show they're taking serious action. And with the Taylor firm involved, this is going to be a very public process. The call ended shortly after, leaving Peterson staring at the dark screen of his phone. 14 years of service, reduced to a cautionary tale. His identity as a respected officer, shattered by 20 minutes of captured video. Rich, Susan's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts. What did Mike say? Peterson looked up, meeting his wife's concerned gaze. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully grasp the magnitude of what had happened, not just to his career, but to Marcus Taylor, to his family, to everything he had believed about himself as an officer and a man. He said, I need to start thinking about a plea deal, Peterson admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The evidence it's bad, Sue, worse than I realized. Susan sank into the chair across from him, her dinner preparations forgotten. Oh, Rich. In the silence that followed, Peterson confronted the questions he had been avoiding since being escorted from the airport. Had he always been this person? Had the job changed him, or merely revealed something that was always there? And most troubling of all, how many others had suffered from his biases before cameras were there to document it, outside their darkened home? Another news van slowly cruised past, searching for the man who had become, in less than 24 hours, a symbol of everything broken in America's approach to security and race. The beer before him had gone warm, untouched, just like the career he had built, just like the reputation he had believed in, just like the life he had taken for granted until approaching a black attorney quietly reading at Gate B12 administrative hearings. The Liberty International Airport Administrative Review Board convened at 9 o'clock a.m. sharp in Conference Room A of the executive offices. The space, typically used for budget meetings and operational planning sessions, had been transformed into a quasi-judicial setting with long tables arranged in a U-shape facing a central podium. Airport Director Thomas Garcia sat at the center, flanked by Human Resources Director Pamela Ortiz and Chief of Airport Security Victor Ramirez. Richard Peterson sat alone at a small table to the right, his union representative Michael Fogel beside him. Peterson had traded his uniform for a dark blue suit that hung awkwardly on his frame, as if borrowed from a slightly larger man. His typical confident posture had collapsed into something more defensive, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, hands clasped tightly before him. Officer Elena Rodriguez waited in a small anteroom, reviewing her notes one final time before being called to testify. Her uniform was impeccably pressed, her demeanor professional, but the dark circles under her eyes betrayed the toll of the past 48 hours. "This special administrative hearing is now in session," Garcia began, his voice formal and measured. "The purpose of today's proceeding is to review the events of November 3rd, 2025, at Gate B12, specifically the actions of Officer Richard Peterson in his detention of passenger Marcus Taylor." He looked directly at Peterson. "This is not a criminal proceeding, nor is it a formal disciplinary hearing at this stage. Our goal is to establish a factual record of events to inform subsequent personnel actions and policy reviews. All participants are reminded that these proceedings are being recorded and may be subject to disclosure in related legal actions." Peterson nodded his understanding, though he barely lifted his gaze from the table. "Officer Peterson," Garcia continued, "would you please describe in your own words the events leading to your interaction with Mr. Taylor?" Peterson cleared his throat, finally looking up. His union representative slid a prepared statement toward him, but Peterson pushed it aside. After 48 hours of reflection, media scrutiny, and personal reckoning, he had decided to speak without the sanitized language of legal counsel. "I was on patrol at Terminal B with Officer Rodriguez," he began, his voice hoarse. "Standard security sweep. I observed a passenger sitting alone, separated from the main gate area. He appeared to be watching the security checkpoint while pretending to work on a tablet." "And what specifically about this behavior raised concerns?" Ramirez asked, his tone neutral but his expression skeptical. Peterson hesitated. In the harsh fluorescent lighting of the conference room, the justifications that had seemed so solid 2 days ago now felt paper-thin. He was sitting apart from others. Expensive clothes, but very still, very watchful. It matched some profile indicators for surveillance behavior. "Which specific profile indicators?" Ramirez pressed. "Please cite the relevant sections of our security protocols." Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Section 4.7 covers suspicious behavioral indicators, including isolation from normal passenger groupings, extended observation of security procedures. Section 4.7 also requires documented observation of a minimum of 3 specific behavioral markers before initiating contact. Ramirez noted, "Your incident report lists only one, suspicious positioning, which is not actually among the approved behavioral markers in our protocols." The implied criticism hung in the air. Peterson's report, hastily filed after the incident, had been a transparent attempt to retroactively justify an approach that had been based more on instinct or bias than protocol. "Officer Peterson," Garcia interjected, "the security camera footage shows Mr. Taylor was focused on his tablet and wearing noise-canceling headphones. At no point before your approach does he appear to be observing the security checkpoint or exhibiting any behavior consistent with surveillance. Would you care to reconcile that with your statement?" Peterson's face flushed. "Camera angles don't show everything. I had a clear line of sight. We have footage from 7 different angles." Garcia cut him off. "None support your assertion." Fogel, the union representative, leaned forward. "Director Garcia, my client is entitled to explain his professional assessment without interruption. The subjective nature of security observations is precisely why we have established protocols with objective criteria." Garcia completed the thought. "Protocols that were apparently disregarded in this instance." He turned back to Peterson. "After your initial approach, you requested Mr. Taylor's identification, which he provided. What happened next?" Peterson swallowed hard. His attitude was confrontational. When I questioned his destination and purpose, he gave short answers that seemed evasive. The audio recordings indicate he provided direct answers to your questions, Pamela Ortiz noted. He identified himself as a lawyer traveling to Chicago. What about those responses did you find evasive? It was his manner, not the words themselves, Peterson insisted. Years on the job, you develop an instinct for when someone is hiding something. And what was Mr. Taylor hiding? Garcia asked pointedly. Peterson had no answer. The questioning continued for nearly an hour, methodically dismantling Peterson's justifications for each escalating action, the decision to run a background check, the confiscation of Marcus's phone, the physical detention, the handcuffing. With each exchange, the gulf between established protocols and Peterson's actions grew more glaring. Finally, Rodriguez was called to testify. She entered the room with military precision, took her seat at the central podium, and faced the review board directly. Officer Rodriguez, Garcia began, as the secondary officer present during the incident, please share your observations of the interaction between Officer Peterson and Mr. Taylor. Rodriguez took a deep breath. Officer Peterson identified Mr. Taylor as a subject of interest without consulting me or specifying which behavioral indicators triggered his concern. When we approached, Mr. Taylor was polite and immediately complied with the request for identification. Did you observe any behavior from Mr. Taylor that would justify a security intervention under our protocols? Ramirez asked. No, sir. Mr. Taylor was sitting quietly, working on his tablet. When approached, he was respectful and cooperative. Peterson stared at his partner, a mixture of betrayal and resignation in his expression. He had expected the thin blue line to hold, for Rodriguez to at least soften her account with professional courtesies. Did you attempt to intervene as the situation escalated? Garcia continued. Rodriguez nodded. 3 times. I suggested we verify the boarding pass rather than detain. I recommended calling for supervisory presence when the situation began to escalate, and I explicitly stated we should follow protocol for disputed detentions rather than proceeding with handcuffs. And how did Officer Peterson respond to these interventions? He dismissed them, Rodriguez stated flatly. He overrode my suggestions without consideration and proceeded with the detention, despite the lack of justifying factors. The room fell silent as the review board absorbed her testimony. Rodriguez had effectively corroborated what the video evidence already showed. Peterson had acted unilaterally, against established protocols, and in disregard of his partner's attempts at de-escalation. Officer Rodriguez, Pamela Ortiz asked, in your professional assessment, was there any security-based justification for Mr. Taylor's detention? Rodriguez met Peterson's gaze briefly before answering. No, ma'am, there was no security justification for the detention. Peterson's shoulders slumped further, the last pillar of professional support crumbling beneath him. After Rodriguez was dismissed, Garcia addressed Peterson directly. Officer Peterson, this board has reviewed extensive evidence relating to this incident, including security footage, passenger videos, your written report, witness statements, and now testimony from both you and Officer Rodriguez. We have also examined your personnel file, including the 11 prior complaints of excessive force and biased enforcement. He leaned forward, his expression grave. Based on this comprehensive review, this board finds that your actions on November 3rd constituted egregious violations of Liberty International Airport security protocols, potential violations of Mr. Taylor's civil rights, and conduct unbecoming of an officer entrusted with public safety responsibilities. Peterson stared at the table, his future collapsing before him in real time. Effective immediately, Garcia continued. You are terminated from your position with Liberty International Airport Security. This termination is for cause, specifically violation of established security protocols, improper detention of a passenger without justification, use of unprofessional and biased language, and failure to follow supervisory guidance. Fogel began to protest, but Garcia raised a hand to silence him. Furthermore, all records related to this incident and your employment history will be provided to the Department of Justice for their ongoing civil rights investigation. The airport will not contest any findings of liability related to your actions and will cooperate fully with federal authorities. The formal language did little to soften the devastating impact of the decision. Peterson had gone from respected officer to unemployed pariah in less than 72 hours. As the hearing concluded, Rodriguez paused briefly beside Peterson's table. "I'm sorry, Rich," she said quietly, "but I had to tell the truth." Peterson didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the tabletop where his badge and airport credentials lay surrendered. 14 years of identity, stripped away in a 20-minute administrative hearing. Outside the conference room, reporters gathered in anticipation of an official statement. The airport's decision to terminate Peterson would make headlines, but it represented only the beginning of the accountability process, not its conclusion. In Manhattan, the Taylor legal team was already preparing for the next phase federal civil rights charges that would transform Peterson's administrative failure into a criminal case with far-reaching implications for transportation security nationwide. Federal case building. The federal courthouse in Newark buzzed with activity as prosecutors from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division gathered in a secure conference room. The space had been temporarily converted into a command center for what was rapidly becoming one of the division's highest-profile cases of the year. Deputy Director Gabriela Morales stood before a detailed evidence board, where photos, documents, and timeline elements had been meticulously arranged to map out the case against Richard Peterson. At 44, Morales had built her career prosecuting civil rights violations, earning a reputation for methodical preparation and uncompromising pursuit of institutional accountability. "We're not just building a case against one officer," she explained to the assembled team of federal prosecutors and FBI agents. "We're constructing a comprehensive challenge to systemic practices at Liberty International Airport. Peterson is the entry point, but our target is much broader." She tapped a document displayed on the central screen. Peterson's complete personnel file, obtained through federal subpoena, 11 excessive force complaints over 14 years, 9 involving minority passengers. That's not coincidence. That's pattern. The airport's failure to properly address these complaints represents a systemic breakdown in accountability measures. Special Agent Carlos Diaz, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, nodded in agreement. "The text message evidence is particularly damning. We've identified exchanges with 5 other officers that demonstrate explicit racial bias and intentional targeting of minority passengers. Peterson wasn't a lone wolf, he was part of an ingrained culture." "What's our strongest charge?" asked Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Sullivan, the lead prosecutor assigned to the case. "Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. Morales replied without hesitation. "Deprivation of rights under color of law. The elements are clear. Peterson was acting under color of law as an airport security officer. He willfully deprived Marcus Taylor of his Fourth Amendment right against unreasonable search and seizure, and the evidence strongly suggests racial motivation, which enhances potential penalties." "Maximum sentence?" Sullivan asked, making notes on her legal pad. 10 years if we can prove the civil rights violation was motivated by racial animus, which the text messages and witness statements strongly support." Morales confirmed. "We'll also include charges for filing false reports based on Peterson's incident documentation, which directly contradicts video evidence." The team moved through additional evidence elements, the statistical analysis showing disproportionate detention rates for minority passengers at Liberty International, the airport's failure to implement reforms mandated by previous settlements, and the testimony of Officer Rodriguez regarding Peterson's disregard for established protocols. "What about the broader case against Liberty International?" asked another prosecutor. "Are we pursuing institutional charges?" Morales nodded. "We're preparing to file a pattern and practice lawsuit under Title 34, U.S.C., Section 12601. The evidence suggests systematic failures in training, supervision, and accountability that allowed officers like Peterson to engage in discriminatory practices despite multiple red flags." She moved to another section of the evidence board, where airport policies and training materials were displayed alongside statistical data on passenger detentions. The airport was already under a consent decree from the Williams case last year, which mandated specific reforms to prevent exactly this type of incident. Morales explained, "Their failure to implement those reforms effectively gives us significant leverage for more comprehensive institutional changes." Agent Diaz added, "We've also identified potential witnesses among former Liberty International officers who can speak to the culture of selective enforcement. 3 have already provided preliminary statements describing unofficial profiling quotas and supervisory pressure to demonstrate security activity through passenger stops." The gravity of the case was not lost on anyone in the room. What had begun as a single incident at Gate B12 had expanded into a federal investigation with potential to reshape security practices at airports nationwide. The combination of clear video evidence, Peterson's documented history, and the institutional failures at Liberty International created a perfect storm for meaningful reform. Timeline for charging decisions, Sullivan asked, glancing at her calendar. We move quickly, Morales replied firmly. Grand jury presentation next week. Indictment within 10 days if everything proceeds as expected. This case has significant public interest, and we want to demonstrate that civil rights enforcement is a genuine priority. She paused, surveying the assembled team. I want to be absolutely clear about one thing: this case will be prosecuted on its merits, not its media profile. Yes, Marcus Taylor is Jonathan Taylor's son. Yes, there's viral video. But we would pursue these charges with equal vigor if the victim were unknown and unconnected. The evidence is what matters, and the evidence here is overwhelming. The team nodded in collective agreement. The fundamental strength of the case transcended its high-profile nature. Peterson's actions, captured from multiple angles and corroborated by witness testimony, represented a textbook civil rights violation. The supporting evidence of institutional failures at Liberty International only strengthened the broader implications. One last thing, Morales added as the meeting concluded. Jonathan Taylor has indicated that while his firm will pursue civil remedies against the airport, they fully support our criminal prosecution and will provide complete access to their evidence and witnesses. That level of cooperation will significantly streamline our process. As the team dispersed to their respective assignments, Morales remained at the evidence board, studying the photograph of Marcus Taylor, dignified despite the handcuffs, composed despite the public humiliation. She had known the Taylor family professionally for years, had worked with Jonathan on previous civil rights cases, and had even attended Marcus's law school graduation. But personal connections aside, the case represented something far more significant: an opportunity to establish clear precedent regarding racial bias in transportation security. With air travel being an essential component of modern life, ensuring equal protection under the law in that context carried profound implications for American civil liberties. The clock was ticking. In Washington, the Attorney General had requested daily briefings on the case's progress. In New York, the Taylor legal team was preparing parallel civil proceedings. And in New Jersey, Richard Peterson was about to face the full weight of federal prosecution for actions that, until recently, he had considered routine aspects of his job. Justice was moving with unusual speed, accelerated by clear evidence, public attention, and the convergence of individual and institutional accountability. What Peterson had set in motion with a single biased approach at Gate B12 would continue far beyond his own case, potentially reshaping the relationship between security officers and the diverse public they were sworn to protect. The sharp smell of fresh coffee permeated the room as an assistant brought in a fresh carafe. Outside the window, rain began to fall, the patter against glass providing a gentle counterpoint to the intense focus inside. Morales' phone buzzed with a message from the Attorney General. The White House was now monitoring the case. The ripples from Gate B12 continued to expand. Marcus's strategic approach. The Chicago Marriott Ballroom fell silent as Marcus Taylor approached the podium. The National Bar Association conference had adjusted its schedule to make his keynote address the central event, and the room was filled beyond capacity. Attorneys, judges, law students, and media representatives crowded together in anticipation. The scent of coffee and cologne mingled in the air, and the soft rustle of program booklets ceased as Marcus took his position. Marcus surveyed the audience, taking a moment to collect his thoughts. He felt the weight of his watch against his wrist, the same wrist that had borne handcuff marks just 24 hours earlier. The silver microphone before him reflected the stage lights, momentarily blinding him with a flash that reminded him of camera flashes at Gate B12. The speech he had prepared weeks ago, a measured academic discussion of Fourth Amendment protections in transportation settings, had been entirely rewritten in the 48 hours since his detention at Liberty International. What had been theoretical was now deeply personal. 2 days ago, he began, his voice steady and resonant. I was handcuffed at Gate B12 of Liberty International Airport while waiting to board a flight to this conference. He paused, allowing the weight of that simple statement to settle over the room. The silence was complete except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional click of a journalist's camera. I was detained not because I posed any threat, not because I had violated any regulation, but because I existed in a space where someone with authority decided I didn't belong. Marcus rolled back his shirt cuffs slightly, revealing the faint red marks that still lingered on his wrists. The gesture was subtle but powerful, physical evidence of abstract constitutional violations. Several audience members audibly gasped, the sound rippling through the ballroom. What happened to me has happened to countless Americans who don't have law degrees, who don't have famous fathers, who don't have the benefit of being recorded by dozens of witnesses. The only unusual aspect of my experience is that there may actually be consequences this time. The audience listened with rapt attention as Marcus methodically walked through his detention, analyzing each moment from both legal and personal perspectives. He identified 7 distinct constitutional violations, explained the relevant case law, and connected his individual experience to broader patterns of discriminatory enforcement in transportation security. But unlike a typical legal lecture, Marcus infused his analysis with the lived reality of being handcuffed in public, the humiliation, the anger, the calculation required to maintain composure while being degraded. I made a deliberate choice in that moment, he explained. I could have responded with justified anger, with emotional protest. Instead, I chose to become a real-time legal observer of my own rights being violated. I documented. I clearly stated the violations occurring. I created a record for what would come next. Marcus paused to take a sip of water, the ice cubes clinking gently against the glass. He felt a momentary tightness in his chest as the memory of Peterson's hand gripping his arm flashed through his mind. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. That choice wasn't just about protecting myself. It was about creating the foundation for systemic change. Personal vindication is important, but institutional transformation is essential. As Marcus continued, he outlined the multi-pronged strategy that was now unfolding across several jurisdictions: the federal criminal investigation targeting Peterson, the civil rights lawsuit against Liberty International Airport, the policy reform initiatives being developed in consultation with transportation security experts. What we're building isn't just a case, Juan, he explained. It's a comprehensive framework for accountability and reform. The goal isn't punishment, it's transformation. We want security systems that protect everyone equally, that operate without bias, that balance genuine safety concerns with constitutional protections. In the audience, civil rights attorneys nodded in recognition of the approach. It bore the unmistakable strategic fingerprints of Jonathan Taylor, whose career had been defined by cases that transcended individual grievances to create lasting institutional change. My father taught me that true justice isn't measured by the compensation awarded to a single victim, Marcus continued, acknowledging the influence. It's measured by the systems reformed, the policies rewritten, the practices transformed so that others don't become victims in the first place. As he spoke, slides appeared on the screens behind him, statistical analyses of detention rates at major airports showing clear racial disparities, training materials from Liberty International with problematic language about behavioral indicators, excerpts from previous settlement agreements that had failed to create lasting change. We have a unique opportunity in this moment, Marcus explained, his voice gaining intensity. The combination of clear video evidence, statistical data on discriminatory patterns, and unprecedented public attention creates leverage for meaningful reform rather than superficial changes. He outlined the specific reforms being sought: independent oversight boards for airport security operations with civilian representation, mandatory body cameras for all officers with automated activation during passenger interactions, statistical monitoring of detention patterns with regular public reporting, revised training protocols focused on constitutional limitations and bias recognition, clear accountability measures for officers who engage in discriminatory practices, federal standards for security, protocols to prevent airport-by-airport disparities. These aren't punitive measures, Marcus emphasized. They're protective ones, protecting passengers from unconstitutional treatment, protecting officers from making career-ending mistakes, and protecting our fundamental rights as Americans to move freely without fear of arbitrary detention. The strategic brilliance of the approach was becoming clear to everyone in the room. By focusing on systemic solutions rather than merely punishing Peterson, the Taylor legal team was leveraging a single incident into comprehensive reform that could benefit millions of travelers. Marcus glanced down at his watch. It read exactly 7:42. At that precise moment, he displayed a slide showing Officer Peterson's text message log. One message, highlighted in yellow, stood out from the rest. Always make sure no cameras are rolling before you adjust their attitude. The message was timestamped just 3 days before the Gate B12 incident, evidence that Peterson was fully aware of potential recording and had deliberately tried to avoid documentation of his actions. This critical piece of evidence, the 742 Easter egg that viewers would later pause and analyze in depth, directly contradicted Peterson's later testimony that he hadn't been conscious of being recorded. It was the smoking gun proving premeditation in his approach to selective enforcement. As Marcus concluded his address, he returned to the personal dimension of his experience. The room was utterly silent, hundreds of legal professionals hanging on every word. I stand before you today as both a victim of discrimination and an architect of the response. That dual perspective informs everything about our approach to this case. We seek justice that heals rather than justice that merely punishes. We pursue changes that transform rather than settlements that simply compensate. He paused, looking out at the assembled legal professionals. The weight of collective experience in the room, thousands of civil rights cases, countless hours in courtrooms fighting similar battles, created a moment of profound professional solidarity. Officer Peterson made a critical error when he approached me at Gate B12, not because of who my father is, not because of the cameras recording, but because his actions violated fundamental constitutional principles that we, as attorneys, have sworn to protect. Our response will ensure that his error becomes a catalyst for lasting change rather than just another statistic in the long history of discriminatory enforcement. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 3 minutes. The thunderous applause echoed off the ballroom's high ceiling, creating a physical sensation of approval and solidarity. As Marcus gathered his notes, his phone buzzed with a message from his father. DOJ grand jury presentation scheduled for Monday. Federal charges imminent. The machinery of justice was moving with unusual speed, driven by the clear evidence and strategic pressure from multiple directions. What had begun as a humiliating detention was transforming into a landmark case that could reshape transportation security protocols nationwide. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket and acknowledged the continuing applause with a modest nod. The path forward was clear, not revenge against a single officer, but reform of an entire system that had allowed bias to masquerade as security for far too long. He thought briefly of Officer Rodriguez, whose troubled expression during his detention had revealed her internal conflict. She would be a crucial witness in what was to come, and of Peterson himself, whose career and freedom now hung in the balance. There was no satisfaction in another person's downfall, only in the prospect of meaningful change that might prevent countless future injustices. Parrot Week 4, the legal proceedings. The press room at the Department of Justice was filled to capacity. Cameras and reporters from every major news outlet jostling for position as Deputy Attorney General William Harrison approached the podium. The room fell silent in anticipation of what was widely expected to be a significant announcement regarding the Liberty International Airport incident. The air was thick with anticipation, the smell of coffee and electronics creating a distinctly modern newsroom aroma. "Good morning," Harrison began, his deep voice carrying natural authority. "Today, the Department of Justice is announcing the filing of federal criminal charges against former Liberty International Airport security officer Richard Peterson following a comprehensive investigation into the November 3rd detention of Marcus Taylor at Gate B12. Camera shutters clicked rapidly as Harrison continued, their sound like rainfall in the otherwise silent room. A federal grand jury has returned an indictment charging Peterson with multiple violations of federal law, including deprivation of rights under color of law in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. He paused, allowing the significance to register. This was no minor charge. It was the primary federal civil rights criminal statute, typically reserved for the most serious abuses of authority. The indictment alleges that Peterson willfully deprived Mr. Taylor of his constitutional right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure, as guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment. The evidence presented to the grand jury included video footage, witness testimony, and electronic communications that establish a clear pattern of discriminatory enforcement. Harrison adjusted his glasses, the momentary movement captured by dozens of cameras. Behind him, projected on a large screen, was a formal Department of Justice seal alongside a case number, USA v. Peterson, 25 CR 11432. Additional charges include filing false official reports in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1001, and conspiracy to violate civil rights in violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 241. This latter charge stems from evidence of coordinated discriminatory practices among certain security personnel at Liberty International Airport. The room remained silent, the gravity of the announcement sinking in. Federal criminal charges against law enforcement officers were rare, particularly in transportation security contexts. The message being sent extended far beyond one airport or one officer. If convicted on all counts, Mr. Peterson faces a maximum sentence of 25 years in federal prison. I want to emphasize that this prosecution represents the Justice Department's commitment to ensuring that all Americans can travel freely without fear of discrimination or unconstitutional detention. Harrison turned slightly to acknowledge the team of prosecutors standing to his right. I'm joined today by Deputy Director Gabriela Morales of the Civil Rights Division, who will be leading the prosecution team, and Special Agent Carlos Diaz of the FBI, who led the investigation. Morales stepped forward, her presence commanding immediate attention. Thank you, Deputy Attorney General Harrison. The charges announced today reflect the seriousness with which the Department of Justice views civil rights violations by those in positions of authority. She gestured to a display board showing a timeline of the incident. Our investigation revealed not just isolated misconduct by Officer Peterson, but systematic failures in training, supervision, and accountability at Liberty International Airport. These failures created an environment where discriminatory practices were tacitly permitted despite clear policies prohibiting such behavior. The timeline highlighted key moments from the Gate B-12 incident, from Peterson's initial approach through the handcuffing and ultimately to Marcus's release. Each point was annotated with the specific legal violation alleged to have occurred. I want to be clear that this prosecution is not about one bad actor. Morales continued. It's about upholding the constitutional principles that protect all Americans. When those entrusted with public authority abuse that trust, the integrity of our entire system of justice is compromised. She paused, her expression solemn. The evidence in this case includes text messages between Officer Peterson and other security personnel that reveal explicit racial bias and deliberate targeting of minority passengers. These communications demonstrate that the constitutional violations were not accidental or the result of poor judgment, but willful and motivated by discriminatory intent. A reporter's hand shot up, but Morales raised her palm to indicate she wasn't taking questions yet. In addition to the criminal charges announced today, the Department of Justice has opened a pattern and practice investigation into Liberty International Airport's security operations under Title 34, United States Code, Section 12601. This broader investigation will examine whether the discriminatory practices evident in the Taylor case represent systematic violations requiring institutional reform. The mention of a pattern and practice investigation sent a ripple through the room. Such investigations typically led to consent decrees that mandated comprehensive reforms under federal oversight, a powerful tool for structural change. Officer Peterson has been served with a summons to appear for arraignment next Monday at the federal courthouse in Newark. His attorney has been notified of today's charges. Harrison returned to the podium as Morales stepped back. We'll now take a few questions. Hands shot up across the room. Harrison pointed to a veteran justice correspondent in the front row. Can you comment on the significance of the conspiracy charge? Does this mean other officers will be charged as well? The investigation is ongoing, Harrison replied. The conspiracy charge reflects evidence that the discriminatory practices were not limited to Officer Peterson. We will follow the evidence wherever it leads. Another reporter called out, has Marcus Taylor or his father Jonathan Taylor been involved in the decision to bring charges? Morales stepped forward to answer this one. The Taylor family has cooperated with our investigation by providing evidence and witness statements, as any victim would. However, the decision to bring charges was made independently by career prosecutors based solely on the legal merits of the case. A third question came from the back of the room. What message is the DOJ trying to send with these charges? Harrison's response was measured but firm. The message is simple. Constitutional rights apply everywhere in America, including at airport security checkpoints. No one is above the law, and no one's rights should be violated based on how they look. As the press conference concluded, the implications were clear to everyone in the room. The Department of Justice had decided to make the Peterson case a linchpin in addressing broader issues of discriminatory enforcement in transportation security. What began as a 20-minute interaction at Gate B12 had escalated into a federal prosecution with potential to establish new standards for accountability in airport security operations nationwide. Outside the Justice Department, Richard Peterson watched the press conference on television. The weight of federal charges now added to the personal and professional devastation of the past week. The concept of maximum sentence of 25 years echoed in his mind as the full gravity of his situation finally registered. The plea negotiations. The conference room in the Newark Federal Building had the sterile anonymity common to government facilities. Beige walls, generic furniture, fluorescent lighting that cast everyone in an unflattering pallor. The air conditioner hummed persistently, creating a white noise backdrop for the tense conversation unfolding around the polished table. Michael Fogel, Peterson's union-appointed attorney, spread documents before him with methodical precision. At 55, Fogel had the weary demeanor of someone who had spent decades navigating the complex terrain between police accountability and officer defense. His suit was well-worn but meticulously pressed. His reading glasses perched low on his nose as he reviewed the federal indictment for the dozenth time. Across the table sat Assistant UMS Attorney Rebecca Sullivan and DOJ Civil Rights Division Prosecutor James Martinez. Their posture conveyed the confidence of prosecutors with an airtight case, relaxed but attentive. Their case files considerably thinner than Fogel's desperate collection of precedents and procedural arguments. Richard Peterson sat beside his attorney, a shell of the commanding officer he had been just days earlier. His complexion was ashen, his posture slumped, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights contemplating a future that potentially included federal prison. The handkerchief in his pocket remained folded and unused despite the perspiration beading on his forehead. "Let's be frank," Sullivan began, her voice matter of fact. "The evidence against your client is overwhelming. Multiple video angles, audio recordings, witness statements, text messages demonstrating bias, and a documented history of similar complaints. If this goes to trial, conviction is all but certain." Fogel nodded slightly. They both knew this wasn't posturing. It was simply reality. "We understand the government's position. Our concern is the severity of the charges. Conspiracy seems excessive given—" "Excessive," Martinez interrupted, his tone incredulous. He slid a folder across the table. "These are transcripts of your client's text messages with 5 other officers over the past 2 years. Explicit discussions of targeting minority passengers, jokes about detaining uppity travelers, coordination of enforcement actions based on race rather than security concerns. The conspiracy charge is more than justified." Peterson flinched at hearing his private communications described so clinically. Words typed in what he thought was the safety of colleague banter now reframed as evidence of federal crimes. Fogel adjusted his glasses. "My client acknowledges poor judgment in those communications, but maintains that his actions at Gate B12 were motivated by security concerns, not racial bias." Sullivan's expression made clear her skepticism. "Mr. Fogel, at 7:42 in the security footage, your client can be heard using language that directly contradicts that claim. And text messages sent just minutes before the incident reference another fancy one who needs checking. The pretextual nature of the stop is indisputable." The timestamp 7:42 hung in the air. Peterson shifted uncomfortably, remembering the moment with painful clarity. He had indeed made comments that betrayed his real motivations, unaware that Rodriguez's body camera was already active, capturing audio even before the formal detention began. It was the smoking gun that decimated any defense based on legitimate security concerns. "What's the government offering?" Fogel asked, changing tack. The question acknowledged what everyone in the room already knew. This case would end with a plea, not a trial. Sullivan and Martinez exchanged glances. "We're prepared to drop the conspiracy charge in exchange for guilty pleas to the civil rights violation under Section 242 and the false statements charge," Sullivan replied. "We'd recommend a sentence of 78 months. 6.5 years. Fogel's eyebrows shot up. For a first-time offender with 14 years of service, for a pattern of willful civil rights violations culminating in the public humiliation and detention of an innocent man. Martinez corrected him. The sentencing guidelines would support 108 to 120 months, given the aggravating factors. We're already offering a significant reduction. Peterson's breathing quickened, the reality of potential prison time becoming tangible. The room suddenly felt smaller, the fluorescent lights harsher. He loosened his tie, the fabric feeling constrictive against his neck. What about supervised release? Fogel pressed. My client has a family, a mortgage. 6 months home confinement with probation would... Not happening. Sullivan cut him off firmly. This case has significant public interest, and the violations were too severe for a non-custodial sentence. The best we can do is 60 months with cooperation. Cooperation? Peterson spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. Martinez nodded. Full cooperation with the pattern and practice investigation. Detailed testimony about discriminatory practices at Liberty International, including naming other officers involved in systematic profiling. Documentation of supervisory knowledge and tacit approval of these practices. The implications were clear. A reduced sentence in exchange for Peterson becoming a witness against his former colleagues. The blue wall of silence would have to come down. I need to consult with my client privately, Fogel said, gathering his papers. Sullivan and Martinez stood. You have 48 hours to accept this offer, Sullivan stated. After that, we proceed with the full indictment and seek the maximum penalties at trial. As the prosecutors left, the conference room fell silent except for the persistent hum of the air conditioner. Peterson stared at the polished surface of the table, seeing his distorted reflection, a visual metaphor for how thoroughly his self-image had been warped by the events of the past week. They have us cornered. Rich, Fogel said quietly, the formality of the negotiation giving way to blunt assessment. The evidence is overwhelming. The public pressure is enormous. The Taylor firm has the resources to pursue this indefinitely. And now they have your text messages. Peterson nodded numbly. What happens if I cooperate to the others? Some will likely face charges. Others will lose their arms. The department will probably end up under a federal consent decree for years. Fogel removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. But if you don't cooperate, you're looking at potentially 10 years in federal prison, and they'll still get most of that information from other sources. They're making an example of me, Peterson muttered, resentment briefly flaring through his exhaustion. Yes, Fogel agreed simply, but only because you gave them the perfect case to do so. The question now is whether you want to be remembered as the officer who fought accountability to the bitter end, or the one who ultimately helped fix a broken system. Peterson fell silent, contemplating the impossible choice before him. The metallic taste of fear lingered on his tongue as he considered what federal prison would mean, years separated from his family. His identity as a law enforcement officer transformed into a liability among the inmate population. Outside the window, a commercial jet traced a white line across the blue sky, passengers inside going about their travels, unaware of how their rights and protections were being negotiated in rooms like this across the country. Among them, perhaps, was someone like Marcus Taylor, just trying to get to their destination without being judged for who they were rather than what they did. I need to talk to Susan, Peterson finally said. And then he trailed off, the weight of consequence momentarily overwhelming his ability to form words. And then you need to decide. Fogel completed the thought. But Rich, as your attorney, I need you to understand the evidence doesn't leave much room for debate about the outcome here. The only real question is how severe the consequences will be. Peterson nodded again, accepting what he had been resisting for days. Accountability had finally caught up to him, and the price would be measured in years, not apologies. Rodriguez's cooperation. The federal building's witness preparation room was designed to put cooperating witnesses at ease, comfortable chairs, neutral decor, windows offering views of the Newark skyline rather than intimidating government emblems. For Elena Rodriguez, however, no amount of environmental comfort could ease the moral complexity of her position. She sat with perfect posture, her off-duty clothes, jeans and a simple blouse, a stark contrast to the uniform she had worn with such pride for 6 years. Before her on the table sat a cup of tea, untouched and cooling. The steam that had risen from it minutes earlier had dissipated. Much like her certainty about her professional identity, Gabriela Morales sat across from her, case files neatly arranged between them. "Officer Rodriguez," she began, "I want to thank you for your cooperation thus far. Your statement to Internal Affairs was crucial in establishing the timeline of events." Rodriguez nodded, her expression guarded. "I just told the truth. And that's exactly what we need you to continue doing," Morales assured her. "Your perspective as Peterson's partner is invaluable, not just regarding the Taylor incident, but the broader culture at Liberty International." Rodriguez's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, the ceramic smooth against her skin. "You have to understand something," she said quietly. "I'm not doing this to punish Richard. I'm doing it because what happened to Mr. Taylor was wrong. The system failed. All of us." Morales leaned forward slightly, sensing the nuance in Rodriguez's position. "Tell me more about that. How did the system fail?" Rodriguez took a deep breath, organizing thoughts she had been processing for days. "When I joined airport security, I believed I was protecting people. My father came to this country from Honduras with nothing. He taught me that America's greatest strength was how it brought different people together. I wanted to be part of keeping that safe." She paused, memories flickering across her features. "But the training, it was all about looking for indicators, behavioral markers. They never said profile by race, but the examples they used, the scenarios they ran, it was always coded. Middle Eastern men for terrorism scenarios, Hispanic passengers for drug smuggling, Black travelers for fraud or prohibited items." "Was this explicit in the training materials?" Morales asked. "Making notes?" "Not explicitly. No, it was subtle. But then on the job, it became more overt. Senior officers like Peterson would talk about demographics of concern. They'd praise you for good stops that match those profiles. Question you if you focused on passengers who didn't fit their preconceptions." Rodriguez finally took a sip of her tea, grimacing at the lukewarm temperature. "I tried to push back. I filed 3 reports about bias and enforcement patterns. All 3 were dismissed as statistically insignificant. After the 3rd, my supervisor took me aside and said I needed to be a team player if I wanted to advance." "Do you have copies of those reports?" Morales asked. Her interest clearly piqued. "Yes, and emails showing the dismissive responses." Rodriguez reached into her bag, removing a folder containing printed documents. "I've documented everything since my 2nd year. I knew someday it would matter." Morales accepted the folder, quickly scanning its contents. "This is extremely helpful. Officer Rodriguez, it establishes a pattern of institutional awareness and inaction regarding discriminatory practices." Rodriguez's expression tightened. "What happens to the others? Not everyone was like Richard. Some were just following what they were taught, trying to do their jobs. Our focus is on those who knowingly violated civil rights and those in supervisory positions who enabled or encouraged discriminatory practices." Morales explained, "Officers who simply followed training but didn't personally engage in misconduct aren't targets of the criminal investigation." A weight seemed to lift slightly from Rodriguez's shoulders. "And me? What happens to my career after this?" It was the question that had kept her awake for nights, the price of doing the right thing in a system that often punished those who broke ranks. "I can't make guarantees," Morales admitted. "There may be officers who view your testimony as a betrayal, but the pattern and practice investigation will almost certainly result in new leadership and reformed practices at Liberty International. Those changes will need officers who understand both what went wrong and how to fix it." Rodriguez nodded, absorbing the implications. "When I saw what Richard was doing to Mr. Taylor, I tried to intervene. Not forcefully enough, I know that now. I should have been clearer, should have physically stepped between them if necessary. That moment replays in my mind constantly, what I could have done differently." "You did try," Morales acknowledged. "The audio records show 3 separate attempts to de-escalate. That matters in establishing your credibility as a witness." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. An assistant entered with a document for Morales. She reviewed it quickly, her expression revealing nothing. "Peterson's attorney just contacted us," she said after the assistant departed. "He's considering accepting a plea agreement that includes cooperation against other officers and supervisors." Rodriguez's eyes widened slightly. "I never expected that. Few do. Until they're facing federal charges, Morales replied. His cooperation would corroborate much of what you've told us about the departmental culture. Rodriguez fell silent, processing this development. The prospect of Peterson testifying against colleagues represented a seismic shift in the traditional code of silence that had governed law enforcement for generations. "What do you need from me now?" she finally asked, her resolve visibly strengthening. "A comprehensive deposition about your experiences, your observations of Peterson's behavior toward minority passengers, and specific instances of supervisory indifference or encouragement of discriminatory practices. We'll also need you to testify before the grand jury considering charges against other officers." Rodriguez straightened in her chair, her decision crystallizing. "I'll do whatever is necessary, not just for Mr. Taylor, but for every passenger who was ever profiled, detained, or humiliated without cause, and for the officers who want to do this job with integrity but are trapped in a broken culture." Morales nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the perspective we need. The goal isn't just accountability for past wrongs. It's creating a system where security and civil rights aren't treated as opposing forces." As Rodriguez began her formal deposition, recounting years of observed discriminatory practices, the larger significance of her testimony became clear. She wasn't just a witness against Peterson, she was becoming an architect of reform, translating her frontline experience into insights that could reshape transportation security approaches nationwide. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Newark, including the silhouette of Liberty International Airport in the distance. Planes continued taking off and landing, carrying thousands of passengers who would never know how their rights were being redefined through the courage of one officer who chose truth over tribalism. Pre-trial developments. The federal courthouse steps in Newark became the stage for a somber but significant announcement 3 weeks after the indictment. Television crews and print journalists gathered in the brisk November air, breath visible in the cold as they waited for the proceedings to begin. The stone steps, worn smooth by decades of legal traffic, or the weight of justice about to be administered, not through trial, but through negotiation. Michael Fogel approached the bank of microphones first, his client Richard Peterson standing slightly behind him. Peterson looked diminished in civilian clothes, a dark suit hanging loosely on a frame that had lost weight from stress. His eyes downcast, his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat rather than defiance. "This morning," Fogel began, his voice carrying across the courthouse plaza, "my client, Richard Peterson, has agreed to plead guilty to violating the civil rights of Marcus Taylor under color of law, in violation of Title 18 United States Code, Section 242. As part of this plea agreement, the government has agreed to dismiss the conspiracy charge." Reporters immediately began shouting questions, but Fogel raised a hand to indicate he wasn't finished. The cold wind rustled papers and buffeted microphones, adding a soundtrack of urgency to the proceedings. "Mr. Peterson acknowledges that his actions on November 3rd at Liberty International Airport violated Mr. Taylor's constitutional rights. He accepts full responsibility for his conduct and the harm it caused. As part of the plea agreement, Mr. Peterson has agreed to cooperate fully with the ongoing federal investigation into practices at Liberty International Airport." The significance of this last statement rippled through the assembled press corps. Peterson's cooperation represented a rare breach in the traditional solidarity among law enforcement personnel, a recognition that accountability might require painful truths about systemic practices. "My client has also agreed to make a public apology to Mr. Taylor, which he will deliver at his sentencing hearing. At this time, we will not be taking questions about the details of the plea or the ongoing investigation." Peterson never spoke during the announcement, his silence as notable as his attorney's carefully crafted statement. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, occasionally darting to the margins of the crowd as if searching for familiar faces, perhaps former colleagues or family members who might offer some anchor in the storm of consequences he now faced. As Peterson and Fogel retreated back into the courthouse, the scene shifted to the Department of Justice press room, where Deputy Director Gabriela Morales stood before a different set of cameras, addressing the plea agreement from the prosecution's perspective. "Today's guilty plea represents an important step toward accountability in this case," Morales stated, her tone professional but firm. "Officer Peterson has admitted to willfully violating Marcus Taylor's constitutional rights through an unlawful detention motivated by discriminatory intent. The plea agreement includes a recommended sentence of 60 months in federal prison, which reflects both the seriousness of the violation and the defendant's acceptance of responsibility and cooperation. The clinical legal language did little to convey the human dimensions of the case, the humiliation Marcus had endured, the career Peterson had lost, the ripple effects through families and communities on both sides. But the justice system, with its necessary formalities, continued its methodical process toward resolution. More significantly, Morales continued, this plea represents an acknowledgement of the broader issues at play in transportation security. Mr. Peterson's cooperation is providing valuable insights into institutional practices that enable discriminatory enforcement. The pattern and practice investigation at Liberty International Airport is ongoing and has already identified systemic failures in training, supervision, and accountability mechanisms. Inside the courthouse, in a private conference room away from cameras and reporters, Marcus Taylor sat with his father and their legal team, receiving a briefing on the plea agreement from Assistant U.S. Attorney Rebecca Sullivan. He's agreed to the factual basis that includes acknowledgement of racial motivation, Sullivan explained, sliding documents across the polished table. That's significant, not just for your case, but for establishing precedent in future civil rights prosecutions. Marcus reviewed the paperwork, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. And the cooperation component. What does that involve specifically? Full disclosure of discriminatory practices at Liberty International. Sullivan replied, names of other officers who engaged in profiling, details of supervisory knowledge and tacit approval, documentation of how complaints were systematically dismissed. He's already provided information that has led to the identification of 3 additional officers who will likely face charges. Jonathan Taylor nodded approvingly. That institutional component is what matters most. Individual accountability is important, but systemic reform is the real objective. Marcus set the documents down, his fingers lingering momentarily on the pages that detailed Peterson's admission of bias. Has he said anything about what was going through his mind when he approached me? Sullivan hesitated, slightly surprised by the question. He has, in his proffer session, he described a gradual hardening of attitudes over his 14 years in the job. He talked about how security protocols became increasingly focused on behavioral indicators that were really just proxies for racial profiling. And he admitted that his personal frustrations about changing social attitudes found an outlet in his authority over passengers. I'd like to hear that directly, Marcus said quietly. At the sentencing hearing, not for vindication, but for understanding. This was never just about punishing one officer. As the meeting concluded, the different parties in this legal drama moved forward on their separate tracks. Peterson toward a future constrained by the consequences of his actions. The prosecutors toward expanding their investigation beyond one officer to the institutional culture that enabled him. And Marcus toward the complex emotional terrain of seeing justice served while remaining committed to healing rather than retribution. Outside the courthouse, the crisp fall air carried the scent of approaching winter. Commuters hurried past, most unaware of the significant legal proceedings that had just occurred, proceedings that would ultimately affect air travel, policies affecting millions of Americans. The quiet transformations of justice often happen this way, in conference rooms and courthouses, far from the dramatic moments that first bring issues to public attention. The scene at Gate B12, now famous through countless views and shares, had lasted less than 30 minutes. Its legal aftermath would unfold over years, reshaping policies, careers, and lives in ways that would extend far beyond one officer and one passenger whose paths had crossed on an ordinary November afternoon. The courtroom scene, the federal courtroom in Newark, carried the weight of history in its architecture. High ceilings, polished wood, and the formal trappings of a system designed to inspire both respect and solemnity. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting geometric patterns on the floor as participants took their positions for the sentencing hearing. U.S. District Judge Amelia Wright presided from the bench, her black robe and composed demeanor embodying the gravitas of federal authority. At 59, Judge Wright had earned a reputation for balanced sentencing that acknowledged the human dimensions of cases while upholding the law's requirements. Her reading glasses rested low on her nose as she reviewed final documents before the proceedings began. The gallery was filled to capacity, the hard wooden benches accommodating an unusual mix of observers, journalists with notepads, law students studying a case likely to appear in future textbooks, civil rights advocates tracking a landmark prosecution, and family members from both sides of the case. The Taylors seated prominently in the front row. The Petersons tucked more discreetly near the back. Richard Peterson sat beside his attorney at the defense table, dressed in a conservative gray suit that seemed to hang more loosely on his frame than when it was purchased. The past 3 months had carved new lines into his face and added streaks of gray to his temples. His hands rested on the table before him, occasionally fidgeting with a small stack of note cards containing his prepared statement. Across the aisle, the prosecution team led by Gabriela Morales arranged materials with practiced efficiency. The case file before them was considerably thinner than it would have been for a trial, the plea agreement having eliminated the need for most exhibits in witness testimony. At precisely 10 o'clock a.m., the courtroom deputy called for all to rise as Judge Wright officially opened the proceedings. The rustle of movement and murmur of voices fell silent as she began. "Please be seated," she instructed, her voice firm but not harsh. "We are here for sentencing in the matter of United States versus Richard Peterson, case number 25-CR11432. The defendant has previously entered a guilty plea to violating civil rights under color of law, specifically the Fourth Amendment rights of Marcus Taylor." She looked directly at Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, before we proceed, I want to confirm that you understand the plea agreement you have entered and that you did so voluntarily and with full knowledge of its consequences." Peterson rose slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. And you understand that under this agreement, you face a sentence of up to 60 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release." "Yes, Your Honor." His voice was quiet but clear, carrying the resignation of someone who had accepted inevitable consequences. Judge Wright nodded. "Very well. We will now proceed to victim impact statements, followed by the government's sentencing recommendation, the defense's position, and finally the defendant's statement." She turned toward the gallery. "Mr. Taylor, if you wish to address the court regarding the impact of the defendant's actions, you may do so now." Marcus Taylor rose with dignified composure, buttoning his suit jacket as he approached the podium. Unlike many victims in similar cases, his statement would not be delivered from the emotional perspective of ongoing trauma, but through the measured lens of a constitutional attorney analyzing the broader significance of what had occurred. "Thank you, Your Honor," he began, adjusting the microphone to his height. "I stand before this court not seeking vengeance but acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that what happened to me at Gate B12 was not an isolated incident, but a manifestation of systemic issues that affect countless travelers who don't have the platform or resources that I do." The courtroom remained utterly silent. Judge Wright's attention focused completely on Marcus's words. "When Officer Peterson approached me that day, he didn't see a passenger, a professional, or even a person. He saw a profile, a stereotype, a target for the authority he wielded without proper constraints. That approach, seeing categories rather than individuals, is the root of the constitutional violations we're addressing today." Marcus's voice remained steady, his training as an attorney evident in his precise language and measured delivery. The physical experience of being handcuffed in public was humiliating. The emotional impact of being treated as inherently suspicious was degrading. But the most profound harm lies in the reinforcement of a two-tiered system where some Americans must constantly prove their right to exist in spaces where others move freely without question. He paused briefly, gathering his thoughts. "Your Honor, I recognize that Officer Peterson's guilty plea represents a significant acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I acknowledge his cooperation with authorities investigating broader patterns at Liberty International Airport. Those steps matter. However, I ask the court to consider that the sentence imposed today will send a message about how seriously our justice system takes the constitutional protections that should apply equally to all Americans." As Marcus concluded his statement and returned to his seat, the emotional restraint he had maintained began to show small cracks. His father placed a supportive hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture that communicated volumes between two men who had dedicated their lives to civil rights law. Judge Wright then called on the prosecution for their recommendation. Gabriela Morales approached the podium with the confidence of someone whose legal position was unassailable. "Your Honor, the government recommends a sentence of 60 months incarceration followed by 3 years of supervised release, consistent with the plea agreement." She detailed the factors supporting this recommendation, the seriousness of constitutional violations by a sworn officer, the documented pattern of similar behavior toward minority passengers, the public nature of the humiliation inflicted, and the breach of public trust inherent in abuse of authority. While we acknowledge Mr. Peterson's eventual acceptance of responsibility and subsequent cooperation, we cannot overlook the gravity of willfully violating a citizen's constitutional rights while acting under color of law. The sentence must reflect both the specific harm to Mr. Taylor and the broader damage to public confidence in equal protection under law. When Michael Fogel rose to present the defense position, his approach acknowledged the inevitability of incarceration while appealing to the court's discretion regarding conditions. Your Honor, we do not contest the 60-month sentence outlined in the plea agreement. Mr. Peterson has accepted responsibility for his actions and has cooperated extensively with investigations that will lead to meaningful reforms at Liberty International Airport. Fogel's tone was appropriately somber, free from the defensive posturing that often characterizes sentencing arguments. We would, however, ask the court to recommend placement at a minimum security facility within 500 miles of Mr. Peterson's family. His cooperation with authorities has created potential safety concerns in a correctional setting. An appropriate placement would mitigate those risks while allowing reasonable family visitation. After Fogel concluded, Judge Wright turned her attention to Peterson. Mr. Peterson, you have the right to address the court before sentencing. Would you like to make a statement? Peterson rose slowly, gathering his note cards with trembling hands. The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath as he approached the podium. The man who had projected such confident authority at Gate B12 now appeared diminished, humbled by the consequences of actions he could never undo. Your Honor, he began, his voice initially unsteady before finding its rhythm. I stand before you today, having lost nearly everything that once defined me, my career, my reputation, my self-image as someone who protected others. He looked down at his notes, then set them aside, deciding instead to speak without the prepared text. What I did to Mr. Taylor was wrong. Not just procedurally wrong or technically incorrect, but fundamentally, morally wrong. I approached him without valid cause. I escalated without justification. I used my authority to humiliate rather than protect. And I did so because I allowed biases I didn't even fully acknowledge to guide my actions. For the first time, Peterson raised his eyes to look directly at Marcus. Mr. Taylor, I am profoundly sorry for what I did to you that day. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Instead, I treated you as a threat based solely on how you looked. There is no excuse for that, and I offer none. The directness of this apology created a palpable shift in the courtroom atmosphere. It was not the scripted, qualified expression of regret often heard in similar proceedings, but a genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Over the past months, I've had to confront uncomfortable truths about myself and the culture I was part of. I've had to recognize how I allowed frustration and resentment to corrupt the authority I was entrusted with. I've had to acknowledge that what I once justified as security instincts were often just prejudices dressed in professional language. Peterson's voice wavered slightly as he continued. I cannot undo what I did to Mr. Taylor or to other passengers who experienced similar treatment, but I can accept the consequences of my actions. Cooperate with efforts to prevent such abuses in the future, and try to make what amends are possible through that cooperation. As Peterson returned to his seat, Judge Wright removed her reading glasses, taking a moment to consider everything she had heard. The courtroom remained silent, the weight of impending judgment creating an almost physical pressure in the air. Before I pronounce sentence, Judge Wright began, I want to address several aspects of this case that warrant special attention. Mr. Peterson, your actions on November 3rd represented a fundamental betrayal of the public trust placed in law enforcement officers. When citizens grant authority to those who secure our transportation systems, they do so with the expectation that this authority will be exercised fairly, without bias, and in accordance with constitutional principles. Her voice carried throughout the courtroom without needing amplification. Clear, measured, and authoritative. The evidence in this case demonstrates not only a violation of Mr. Taylor's Fourth Amendment rights, but a pattern of similar violations targeting minority passengers. Such discriminatory enforcement erodes the foundation of equal protection under law that our justice system depends upon. She turned her attention briefly to Marcus. Mr. Taylor, your measured response in this case, focusing on systemic reform rather than personal retribution, reflects the highest ideals of our legal profession. Your advocacy has already led to significant policy changes at Liberty International Airport and will likely influence transportation security practices nationwide. Returning her gaze to Peterson, Judge Wright continued, Mr. Peterson, while I acknowledge your eventual acceptance of responsibility and your cooperation with ongoing investigations, I cannot overlook the seriousness of willfully violating a citizen's constitutional rights while acting under color of law. She straightened slightly in her chair, her expression solemn. Having considered all factors required by law, including the nature of the offense, the defendant's acceptance of responsibility, the need for deterrence, and the interests of justice, I hereby sentence you, Richard Peterson, to 60 months in the custody of the Bureau of Prisons, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The sentence, though expected under the plea agreement, still landed with finality. Peterson's shoulders slumped visibly as the reality of 5 years in federal prison became official. I will recommend placement at a minimum security facility within 500 miles of your family. As requested, Judge Wright added, upon release, you will be prohibited from seeking or accepting any position in law enforcement or security services during your supervised release period. She gathered her papers, preparing to conclude the proceedings. Mr. Peterson, you will report to the designated facility on January 15, 2026. This court stands adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel punctuated her final words, officially closing this chapter of a case that had begun with a 20-minute interaction at an airport gate and expanded into a landmark civil rights prosecution with implications for transportation security nationwide. As the courtroom began to clear, Marcus and Peterson exchanged a brief glance across the aisle, a moment of human recognition that transcended their adversarial positions. There was no triumph in Marcus's expression, no defiance in Peterson's, only the shared acknowledgement of a process that had transformed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated when their paths first crossed at Gate B12, the sentencing. The sentencing phase proceeded with the formal structure characteristic of federal proceedings, yet beneath the procedural framework lay profound human elements that transcended legal technicalities. As Judge Wright prepared to pronounce the final sentence, she addressed Peterson directly, her tone carrying the full weight of judicial authority tempered with human understanding. Mr. Peterson, I've listened carefully to all statements presented today, reviewed your cooperation agreement, and considered both the harm done and the steps you've taken toward accountability. The courtroom remained utterly silent, the tension almost palpable as everyone present awaited the official determination of consequences. While I recognize your cooperation and acceptance of responsibility, I cannot overlook the fundamental breach of trust your actions represent. When officers abuse their authority, they don't just harm individual citizens, they damage the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Peterson sat rigidly in his chair, his gaze fixed on the judge, accepting her words without visible reaction. Therefore, pursuant to the plea agreement and in accordance with federal sentencing guidelines, I hereby sentence you to 60 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. The sentence, though expected, still fell heavily in the quiet courtroom. Susan Peterson, seated in the back row, closed her eyes briefly, her hand rising to her mouth to stifle any audible reaction. Additionally, Judge Wright continued, you are prohibited from holding any law enforcement or security position during your supervised release period. You will surrender all professional credentials and certifications related to law enforcement or security services. She paused, her expression softening slightly. I will, however, recommend placement at FCI Petersburg, which would allow reasonable family visitation, given your cooperation with ongoing investigations and the potential safety concerns that creates. Appropriate security measures should be considered. With these words, Judge Wright acknowledged the complex reality Peterson now faced, a former officer entering the federal prison system as someone who had testified against colleagues, a position that carried inherent risks. You will report to the designated facility on January 15, 2026. Until then, you will remain on pre-sentencing release under current restrictions. The proceedings concluded with procedural details about appeal rights in post-sentencing procedures, But the substance of the matter was settled. Richard Peterson, once a respected security officer, would spend the next 5 years in federal custody. His career, reputation, and freedom forfeit to 20 minutes of biased judgment. As the courtroom began to empty, Marcus remained seated, observing the aftermath with a contemplative expression. His father leaned close, speaking quietly. "Are you satisfied with the outcome?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "Satisfied isn't the right word," he finally replied. "Justice was served in legal terms. But there's no satisfaction in seeing someone's life dismantled, even when they've earned the consequences." Jonathan nodded, understanding his son's perspective. "The institutional reforms will be the lasting legacy here. Peterson's sentence matters, but the consent decree that's coming for Liberty International will affect millions of travelers for years to come." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, Marcus noticed Peterson standing with his wife near the courtroom exit. Their eyes met briefly across the room, a moment of silent acknowledgement between two men whose lives had become irrevocably connected through a chance encounter at Gate B12. There was no triumph in Marcus's gaze, no hatred or satisfaction at Peterson's downfall. There was only the solemn recognition that justice, while necessary, carried human costs on all sides. The system had worked as intended, holding power accountable when abused, but the human consequences remained complex and sobering. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Marcus for comment on the sentencing. His response reflected the measured perspective that had characterized his approach throughout the case. Today's sentencing represents accountability for individual actions, but our focus remains on the systemic changes needed to prevent similar incidents in the future. The Taylor Initiative will continue working with transportation authorities nationwide to ensure that security and civil rights are treated as complementary rather than competing interests. As Marcus departed, the courthouse steps gradually cleared, returning to their normal state of anonymous legal traffic. But the precedent established within those walls would echo through transportation security protocols across the country, reshaping how authority was exercised in America's airports for years to come. The justice system, with all its formality and procedure, had responded to a moment captured on countless phones and shared across social media platforms. What happened at Gate B12 would now enter legal textbooks, training manuals, and policy documents, transforming a personal humiliation into institutional reform that would protect countless future travelers from similar experiences. Parrot Wheat 5, The Aftermath, the minimum security federal correctional institution in Petersburg, Virginia bore little resemblance to the maximum security prisons depicted in television dramas. There were no towering walls topped with razor wire, no guard towers with searchlights sweeping the grounds. Instead, the facility resembled a sparse college campus, low buildings arranged around central courtyards, recreational areas with basketball courts, and dormitory-style housing units, rather than traditional cells. Yet despite the relatively benign physical environment, for Richard Peterson, FCI Petersburg represented a profound fall from his former life and identity. As a former law enforcement officer convicted of civil rights violations, he occupied a precarious position in the prison social hierarchy, neither fully accepted by the general population nor protected by the solidarity that sometimes extended to former police in custody. 6 months into his 60-month sentence, Peterson had established a careful routine designed to minimize conflict and pass the time as productively as possible. He woke at 5:30 each morning, before most other inmates, using the quiet early hours for reflection and exercise. The physical activity helped manage the anxiety that had become his constant companion since entering federal custody. On this particular morning, he sat alone at a corner table in the dining facility, methodically consuming a breakfast that bore little resemblance to the home-cooked meals he once took for granted. The institutional oatmeal and powdered eggs were bland but adequate, a fitting metaphor for the stripped-down existence he now inhabited. "Mind if I join you?" The voice belonged to Marcus Reynolds, a former tax attorney serving 4 years for fraud, one of the few inmates who didn't avoid Peterson because of his former profession. Reynolds set his tray down without waiting for a response, a small act of normal human interaction that had become precious in its rarity. "Mail call yesterday," Reynolds commented, arranging his plastic utensils with the precision of someone maintaining civilized habits despite uncivilized circumstances. "Anything from home?" Peterson nodded slightly. Letter from Susan, pictures of Megan's graduation. The mention of his daughter's high school graduation, an event he had witnessed only through photographs, momentarily disrupted his carefully maintained composure. He focused intently on his oatmeal, regaining control of his expression. She looked happy, he added after a moment. Cap and gown, honor cords, heading to Rutgers in the fall. Reynolds nodded approvingly. That's good, man, that's really good. Their conversation paused as a group of inmates passed their table, several casting sidelong glances at Peterson. His status as a former officer was common knowledge, though the specific nature of his crime, violating a black passenger's civil rights, carried its own complicated implications in a prison population disproportionately composed of minorities. Counselor wants to see you, Tuan, Reynolds mentioned after the group moved on. Mentioned something about the programs coordinator having an opening in the GED tutoring program. Peterson looked up, genuine interest crossing his features. Teaching. Yeah, guess they figure your background checks out for working with other inmates. Plus, you've been keeping your head down, following the program. That counts for something in here. The prospect of purposeful activity, of being useful rather than simply warehoused, offered a small but significant ray of hope. In the monotonous landscape of incarceration, even minor variations in routine represented meaningful change. Later that afternoon, in his counselor's office, Peterson received confirmation of the opportunity. Ms. Winters, a veteran Bureau of Prisons employee with 20 years of experience navigating the complex terrain between punishment and rehabilitation, explained the parameters. It's 4 afternoons a week, 2 hours per session, she said, reviewing his file as she spoke. You'd be working with inmates preparing for their GED exams, focusing primarily on mathematics and basic science. Peterson sat with proper posture despite the uncomfortable plastic chair, a habit from his previous professional life that prison had not yet eroded. I'd like that, he said simply. There's something else. Winters continued, closing his file. The Restorative Justice Program is starting a new cohort next month. Given the nature of your offense, you might benefit from participation. Peterson's expression tightened slightly. The Restorative Justice Program involved confronting the impact of one's crimes directly, often through facilitated dialogue with victims or similar survivors. The prospect of such vulnerable exposure ran counter to the protective emotional walls he had carefully constructed. It's voluntary, Winters added, noting his hesitation. But in my experience, inmates who engage with the program tend to serve their time more productively. It's not about additional punishment. It's about understanding and, where possible, making amends. I'll consider it, Peterson replied noncommittally. As he exited the administrative building, returning to the controlled movement of regular prison routine, Peterson's thoughts drifted to Marcus Taylor, the man whose rights he had violated at Gate B12 had shown remarkable composure throughout the legal proceedings, a dignity that contrasted sharply with Peterson's own abuse of authority. In quiet moments, Peterson often replayed that encounter, examining his actions and motivations with the clarity that only consequences can provide. What had he seen when he first spotted Marcus? Not a passenger, not an individual with rights and dignity, but a target for the frustrated authority he had been nurturing for years. The realization brought no comfort, only a growing awareness of how thoroughly he had betrayed his professional oath to protect and serve all citizens equally. That evening, as inmates gathered in the recreation area for their limited personal time, Peterson sat at a metal table with paper and pen, beginning a letter he had contemplated for months but never found the courage to write. Dear Mr. Taylor, he began, then stopped, uncertain how to continue. What could he possibly say that would matter? What words could adequately address the harm he had caused, not just to Marcus personally, but to the broader trust between citizens and those entrusted with their security after several false starts? He settled on simple truth. I am writing not to seek forgiveness, which I have no right to ask for, but to acknowledge directly to you the wrong I committed. At Gate B12, I saw a profile rather than a person. I exercised authority without responsibility. I violated not just your rights, but the fundamental covenant between those who enforce rules and those who live under them. The words flowed more easily once he abandoned pretense, writing not as a former officer seeking mitigation, but as a human being acknowledging harm to another human being. My time in federal custody has provided ample opportunity to reflect on who I was becoming in those years at Liberty International, how I allowed frustration and bias to corrupt the authority I was given. I recognize now that my actions that day were not an aberration, but the culmination of a mindset that had been developing for years. He continued writing as evening shadows lengthened across the recreation yard, the sounds of other inmates' conversations creating a background murmur to his private reckoning. Whether he would actually send the letter remained uncertain. Perhaps the act of writing itself was more for his own processing than for Marcus's benefit. As Peterson completed the letter, a new inmate approached his table, a young man recently arrived, clearly still adjusting to the disorienting reality of incarceration. "They said you help with math," the young man said hesitantly. "I'm trying to get my GED while I'm in here." Peterson carefully folded his letter, tucking it into his pocket. "Yes," he replied, gesturing to the empty seat across from him. "I can help with that." It was a small moment of potential usefulness, not redemption, which Peterson had come to understand was neither quick nor guaranteed, but a tiny step toward finding purpose within punishment. As the two men began reviewing basic algebra concepts, the routines of the prison continued around them, a structured environment designed to contain those whose actions had placed them outside society's boundaries. For Peterson, the irony was inescapable. He had once enforced boundaries, exercising authority over others' freedom of movement. Now he existed within strict boundaries himself, his own freedom curtailed by the consequences of authority abused. It was a symmetry that offered no satisfaction, only the sobering recognition that justice, when it functions properly, holds everyone accountable, even those once tasked with its enforcement. Marcus's initiative, the offices of the Taylor Justice Initiative, occupied the 12th floor of a modern glass building in downtown Manhattan, its panoramic windows offering views of the city skyline and, in the distance, the outline of Liberty International Airport. The symbolism was intentional, a constant visual reminder of the incident that had sparked the organization's creation and the systems it sought to reform. Marcus Taylor stood at these windows, watching planes take off and land in the morning light. At 27, he had leveraged his personal experience into an institutional force for change, transforming the $7.4 million settlement from Liberty International Airport into seed funding for an organization dedicated to transportation security reform. "The DOJ just sent over the draft consent decree," Angela Winters announced, entering his office with a tablet displaying the document. "They've incorporated most of our recommended provisions." Marcus turned from the window, the satisfaction evident in his expression. "Including the Civilian Oversight Board, front and center, independent review authority with actual teeth, subpoena power, access to all security footage, quarterly public reporting requirements. Everything we asked for." He took the tablet, quickly scanning the document that represented months of negotiation between the Department of Justice, Liberty International Airport authorities, and the Taylor Initiative's legal team. What had begun as an individual civil rights case had expanded into comprehensive institutional reform. "They've also agreed to the statistical monitoring framework," Angela continued. "All detention decisions categorized by demographic factors, reviewed monthly for disparate impact. Any statistically significant variations trigger automatic review by the Oversight Board." Marcus nodded approvingly. "And the training provisions. Mandatory annual civil rights training for all security personnel, conducted by independent experts. Body cameras activated for all passenger interactions. Formal documentation requirements for any detention lasting more than 2 minutes." The consent decree represented a fundamental restructuring of Liberty International's security operations, changes that would directly address the systemic failures that had enabled Peterson's discriminatory practices. More importantly, it established a template that was already being considered for implementation at airports nationwide. "The DOJ wants us to participate in the monitoring team," Angela added. 3-year commitment, quarterly site visits, authority to interview security personnel without supervisors present. "Absolutely," Marcus agreed immediately. "We need to be involved in implementation, not just design." Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Vanessa Porter entered, carrying files for their afternoon strategy meeting. Since witnessing the Gate B-12 incident, Porter had transformed from corporate diversity executive to full-time civil rights advocate, leaving her Fortune 500 position to become the Taylor Initiative's Director of Corporate Engagement. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I thought you'd want to see this right away. The Senate Transportation Committee just announced hearings on airport security practices. They've requested your testimony as the lead witness." Marcus accepted the hearing notice, recognizing another opportunity to translate individual experience into structural change. When 3 weeks from today, they're specifically looking at federal standards for passenger rights during security screenings. The potential impact was significant. While the consent decree would transform practices at Liberty International, federal legislation could establish uniform standards across all U.S. airports, affecting millions of travelers daily. "We'll need comprehensive data," Marcus decided. "Statistical analysis from the top 20 airports, testimony from other affected passengers, expert witnesses on constitutional boundaries and security contexts." Angela made notes on her tablet. "I'll contact our research team and the coalition partners. We should coordinate with the ACLU and the National Bar Association to ensure we're not duplicating efforts." As his colleagues departed to begin preparations, Marcus returned to the window, his reflection ghosting against the backdrop of the airport in the distance. The past year had transformed his professional identity, from constitutional attorney arguing abstract principles to living embodiment of those principles' practical importance. The Taylor Justice Initiative had grown rapidly, now employing a staff of 23, including attorneys, policy analysts, data scientists, and community outreach coordinators. Their mission extended beyond the original airport security focus to encompass civil rights protections across all transportation sectors: train stations, bus terminals, border crossings, and cruise ports. Current projects included a national database tracking civil rights complaints in transportation settings, a mobile app providing real-time guidance for travelers facing potential rights violations, training programs for transportation, security personnel focused on constitutional limitations, public education campaigns about passenger rights and documentation protocols. The organization had already handled 374 cases in its first year, with an 86% success rate in achieving policy changes, personnel actions, or financial settlements. But beyond the statistics lay the human impact. Travelers who could move through transportation hubs without the degradation of discriminatory treatment, security officers who received proper training in constitutional boundaries, and a gradually evolving culture that balanced safety and civil liberties. Marcus's assistant buzzed his intercom. "Your father's on line 1. He picked up the phone, greeting Jonathan Taylor with the easy familiarity of two professionals whose work had always been deeply intertwined. "I just heard about the Senate hearings," Jonathan said without preamble. "Significant opportunity. We're already preparing. The consent decree gives us concrete examples of workable reforms, which strengthens the legislative pitch. I spoke with Senator Harris yesterday," Jonathan continued. "She's prepared to introduce companion legislation in the House once the committee hearings conclude. Bipartisan support looks promising. National security conservatives appreciate the accountability measures. Civil liberties progressives support the rights protections." The political landscape had shifted significantly since the Gate B-12 incident went viral. Transportation security reform had transcended traditional partisan divides, revealing common ground between constituencies that typically found little to agree upon: the availability of clear video evidence, the undeniable constitutional violations, and Marcus's measured approach to seeking systemic reform rather than punitive damages had created a rare opening for meaningful bipartisan action. "How are you holding up with all this?" Jonathan asked, the father momentarily taking precedence over the attorney. Marcus considered the question. The past year had been intense: constant media attention, legal proceedings, organizational development, and the emotional processing of his own experience. Yet the work itself provided purpose that transcended personal vindication. "I'm good, Bayan," he replied honestly. "The initiative gives structure to everything, and seeing actual changes implemented at Liberty makes it all worthwhile." After concluding the call, Marcus turned to his afternoon schedule. The organization's rapid growth meant his time was divided between direct legal work, strategic planning, public speaking, and coalition building. Today included meetings with airline executives, conference calls with civil rights partners, and preparation for an upcoming TED Talk on transforming individual injustice into institutional change. As he gathered materials for his next meeting, his phone buzzed with a notification from the organization's monitoring system. Another incident had been reported, a Middle Eastern professor detained at Chicago O'Hare without cause. His academic credentials questioned despite clear documentation. The professor had recorded the interaction using the Taylor Initiative's mobile app, creating precisely the kind of evidence that had proven crucial in Marcus's own case. This was the real measure of progress, not just the changes at Liberty International or the pending federal legislation, but the growing ecosystem of accountability that made civil rights violations harder to commit and easier to address when they occurred. The professor would receive immediate legal support. The incident would be documented in the national database, and the pattern recognition algorithms would flag any similar cases at O'Hare for potential systemic investigation. Marcus added the case to his review list, recognizing that his own experience at Gate B12 was now just one data point in a growing collection of documented incidents driving meaningful reform. What had begun as a humiliating detention had transformed into a catalyst for change that would protect countless travelers who would never know his name or story. That evening, as he prepared to leave the office, Marcus paused at the organization's central mission statement, prominently displayed in the reception area. The Taylor Justice Initiative exists to ensure that constitutional protections extend to all transportation spaces, that security and civil liberties are recognized as complementary rather than competing interests, and that individual dignity is preserved even in the necessary processes of public safety. The words represented both a professional commitment and a personal transformation, the evolution of a private humiliation into a public movement for change that transcended vindication to achieve something more lasting structural reform that would outlive any individual case or consequence. Systemic changes. 1 year after the Gate B12 incident, Liberty International Airport had undergone a transformation that extended far beyond personnel changes or policy revisions. Under the federally mandated consent decree, the entire approach to security operations had been fundamentally restructured around a central principle: effective security and civil rights protections were complementary, not competing, objectives. The physical evidence of change was immediately visible to travelers entering Terminal B. Prominently displayed digital screens now inform passengers of their rights during security interactions, including the right to record all encounters with security personnel, the requirement for officers to state the specific reason for any extended questioning, the availability of multilingual rights information via QR code, contact information for the Civilian Oversight Board that now monitored all security operations. Beyond these visible changes lay deeper structural reforms that were reshaping the relationship between security personnel and the traveling public. Thomas Garcia, still serving as airport director but now operating under significantly different oversight mechanisms, led a tour of the revamped Security Operations Center for federal monitors conducting their quarterly compliance review. Every officer now wears a body camera that activates automatically when passenger interactions begin, Garcia explained, demonstrating the technology for the monitoring team. The footage uploads to secure servers accessible to both our internal accountability unit and the Civilian Oversight Board. The monitoring team, which included a representative from the Taylor Justice Initiative, made notes as Garcia continued the tour. Our detention data is now publicly reported on a monthly basis. He indicated a large dashboard displaying statistical information. Any pattern showing disproportionate impact on specific demographic groups triggers automatic review protocols. The numbers on the screen told a compelling story of institutional transformation: 73% reduction in passenger complaints regarding discriminatory treatment, 64% decrease in detention incidents lasting more than 5 minutes, 89% compliance rate with new documentation requirements for security interventions, 0 substantiated civil rights violations in the past 6 months. Deputy Director Gabriela Morales from the DOJ Civil Rights Division nodded approvingly. These metrics suggest significant progress. How have the officers adjusted to the new accountability measures? Initially, there was resistance, Garcia acknowledged candidly. Change is difficult, especially in a field where officer discretion was traditionally less constrained. But we've actually seen improved morale as officers report greater clarity about expectations and procedures. The tour continued to the training center, where a diverse group of security personnel participated in a constitutional rights workshop led by law professors from Rutgers University. The interactive training used body camera footage from actual encounters to identify potential constitutional issues and develop appropriate responses. Every officer now receives 40 hours of civil rights training annually, Garcia noted. That's 4 times the previous requirement. And crucially, the training is conducted by independent experts rather than internal staff, bringing fresh perspectives and greater credibility. In a nearby classroom, new recruits underwent scenario-based training specifically designed to counter implicit bias in security decisions. The simulation technology presented officers with rapidly changing scenarios requiring split-second judgments about potential security concerns, then analyzed their decision patterns for evidence of demographic-based variations. The technology helps officers recognize their own potential biases before they affect real-world interactions, explained Dr. Angela Williams, the neuropsychologist who had developed the training program. We're seeing significant improvements in decision consistency across demographic factors. Perhaps most significant among the reforms was the establishment of an independent civilian oversight board with genuine authority over security operations. The 7-member board, composed of civil rights attorneys, community representatives, transportation experts, and former security officials, had direct access to all operational data and the power to recommend disciplinary action for officers who violated established protocols. Vanessa Porter, who had witnessed the original Gate B-12 incident, now served as the board's chairperson, her corporate background in accountability metrics providing valuable expertise in evaluating security operations without compromising effectiveness. Our approach isn't about hampering security, Porter explained during the board's public meeting later that afternoon. It's about ensuring that security practices serve their intended purpose without unnecessary infringement on civil liberties. The board's quarterly public hearings had become a model for transparency in security operations, attracting observers from airports nationwide interested in replicating the successful reforms. Today's session included representatives from 17 major transportation hubs seeking to implement similar oversight mechanisms. The data is compelling, Porter noted, addressing the visiting officials. Over the past year, our prohibited item detection rate has increased by 8%, while passenger complaints have decreased by 73%. This demonstrates that respecting civil rights and maintaining effective security are not opposing goals. They're complementary approaches that enhance each other. The reforms at Liberty International had rippled outward, influencing transportation security practices across the country. 23 federal airports had voluntarily adopted the Taylor Protocol requiring officer body cameras and civilian oversight. The Transportation Security Administration had revised its training materials to emphasize constitutional limitations on officer authority. And legislation pending in Congress would establish uniform civil rights standards for all federally regulated transportation hubs. Elena Rodriguez, the officer who had witnessed Peterson's actions at Gate B-12 but failed to effectively intervene, now served as Liberty International's Deputy Director for Compliance and Training. Her unique perspective, understanding both the institutional culture that had enabled discrimination and the reforms needed to prevent it, made her an effective bridge between the security workforce and the new accountability structures. The most significant change isn't in our policies or our technology, Rodriguez told the monitoring team as the tour concluded. It's in our fundamental approach to the relationship between security personnel and the traveling public. We've moved from an adversarial model based on authority and compliance to a service model based on respect and constitutional boundaries. This philosophical shift was perhaps the most profound legacy of the Gate B-12 incident, a recognition that security effectiveness ultimately depended on maintaining public trust, which in turn required consistent respect for civil liberties and individual dignity. As the federal monitoring team completed their quarterly assessment, their report would note not just technical compliance with consent decree requirements, but the emergence of Liberty International as a national model for balancing security imperatives with constitutional protections. What had begun as a crisis of accountability had transformed into a template for institutional reform that preserved safety while protecting rights. The ripple effects continued to spread outward. Law schools now included the case in their civil rights curricula. Security training academies incorporated lessons learned into their procedural instruction. And most importantly, travelers of all backgrounds moved through the airport with the assurance that their rights were protected by systems designed to prevent rather than enable discrimination. On this day, Exactly 1 year after the incident that catalyzed these changes, Marcus Taylor passed through Liberty International Airport en route to a speaking engagement. The officers at the security checkpoint recognized him immediately, not as someone to be targeted, but as the individual whose experience had transformed their profession. They maintained professional courtesy while efficiently completing their security functions, demonstrating in practical terms the balanced approach that had emerged from crisis. As Marcus continued to his gate, he passed beneath a newly installed plaque summarizing the airport's commitment to both safety and rights. Security with dignity, protecting both our travel systems and our constitutional principles. The words represented not just institutional reform, but the broader societal recognition that effective security depended on justice equally applied to all travelers regardless of appearance, origin, or identity. Witness transformation. The luxurious conference room of Meridian Global's headquarters overlooks Central Park, the autumn foliage creating a stunning backdrop for the executive diversity training Vanessa Porter now led. As Chief Executive Officer of Porter Accountability Consultants, she had leveraged her witnessing of the Gate B12 incident into a transformation of her own career and mission. "What would you have done?" she asked the assembled corporate leaders, playing the now famous video footage of Marcus Taylor's detention. When you witnessed discrimination happening in real time, the executives shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs, confronted with a question that transcended theoretical ethics to demand practical moral commitment. "I'd like to think I would have spoken up," offered the CFO of a major banking institution, though his tone suggested uncertainty. "Most of us would like to think that," Porter acknowledged. "But the reality is that intervention requires preparation. It requires knowing what to look for, how to respond effectively, and what tools are available in the moment." She moved through the room with the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. At 46, Porter had walked away from a seven-figure executive position to build an organization focused on transforming bystander awareness into active accountability. Her TED Talk on the subject, titled "When Silence Becomes Complicity, The Bystander's Responsibility," had garnered over 3.8 million views. "I was that bystander at Gate B12, she told the executives. "I recorded what was happening, which was important for documentation. But I could have done more, asked questions, requested supervisor presence, explicitly named the discrimination I was witnessing. Those are the intervention points we need to prepare for before the moment arrives." Porter's transformation from corporate diversity executive to civil rights advocate represented one of the most unexpected ripple effects from the Taylor incident. Her Gate B12 project had grown from a single witness statement into a nationwide network of trained observers who documented discriminatory practices in transportation settings and provided real-time intervention when possible. The project had developed specific protocols for bystander intervention, document with video whenever possible, clearly state objective observations. The officer is detaining this passenger without stating cause, request supervisor presence, and officer identification. Offer to serve as a witness for the targeted individual. Follow up with formal complaints to appropriate oversight bodies. These simple steps had proven remarkably effective in de-escalating potential civil rights violations. As security personnel became increasingly aware that their actions were being monitored not just by official oversight, but by ordinary citizens equipped with both technology and knowledge. The old model was passive observation, Porter explained to the executives. The new model is active accountability. It's not about confrontation, it's about creating real-time awareness that actions are being documented and evaluated against clear standards. Her corporate training programs had been implemented at 43 major companies, integrated into MBA, BA curricula at 17 business schools, and adapted for public sector leadership development in federal agencies, including the Department of Transportation. The core message transcended transportation security to address broader questions of institutional accountability and individual responsibility. When I witnessed what happened to Marcus Taylor, I realized that all my corporate diversity initiatives meant nothing if I wasn't willing to act when discrimination happened right in front of me, Porter told the executives. That realization changed everything about how I understand my professional and personal responsibility. Across town, in a significantly more modest setting, Sophia Williams led a community workshop on digital documentation strategies in a church basement in the Bronx. The sociology student, whose TikTok live stream had helped catalyze national attention to the Gate B12 incident, had transformed her academic focus into practical community education. Your phone isn't just for social media, she explained to the assembled residents, many of whom had experienced discriminatory treatment in transportation settings. It's a civil rights tool, but only if you know how to use it effectively. Williams demonstrated the Taylor Initiative's mobile app, which provided one-touch recording with automatic cloud backup, geotagging, and direct submission capabilities to relevant oversight bodies. The app had been downloaded over 2 million times and had already documented 1,732 potential civil rights violations in transportation settings nationwide. The power dynamic shifts when documentation is happening, Williams explained. What happened at Gate B12 wasn't unusual. What was unusual was how thoroughly it was recorded from multiple angles, creating irrefutable evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. Her National Student Documentation Network, founded in the aftermath of the viral TikTok stream, had grown to include chapters at 78 colleges and universities. The organization trained young people in effective documentation techniques, legal rights regarding recording in public spaces, and responsible sharing protocols that protected privacy while highlighting systemic issues. We're not just recording incidents, Williams told the workshop participants. We're creating patterns of evidence that drive institutional change. Individual videos matter, but it's the aggregate data that transforms policies and practices. Back at Liberty International Airport, James Patterson, the business traveler who had live-streamed the Gate B12 incident to his LinkedIn network, now served on the Civilian Oversight Board monitoring security operations. His corporate background and performance metrics had proven valuable in developing accountability measures that balance security effectiveness with civil rights protections. What we're building here is a model for security governance that preserves both safety and dignity, Patterson explained to a delegation of airport administrators from Europe studying the reforms. The metrics show that constitutional compliance and security effectiveness aren't opposing goals. They're complementary approaches that reinforce each other. These three witnesses, Porter, Williams, and Patterson, represented different aspects of civilian oversight that had emerged from the Gate B12 incident. Their transformation from passive observers to active accountability advocates had created new channels for civil rights protection that operated alongside formal legal structures. Porter's corporate approach focused on institutional leadership and bystander intervention protocols. Williams's grassroots strategy emphasized community empowerment through technology and documentation networks. Patterson's governance perspective addressed systemic metrics and oversight structures. Together, they formed a multi-layered accountability ecosystem that made discriminatory practices increasingly difficult to sustain. Later that evening, the three witnesses gathered with Marcus Taylor for a panel discussion at New York University Law School. The event, titled From Observation to Action, Citizen Accountability in Civil Rights Enforcement, drew an overflow crowd of law students, community activists, and transportation security professionals. The most powerful lesson from Gate B12, Marcus told the audience, wasn't about one officer's misconduct or even one institution's failures. It was about the transformative potential of documented truth. When clear evidence meets strategic advocacy, systems that seemed immovably biased can be reformed with remarkable speed. The witnesses shared their personal journeys from that fateful day at Gate B12 to their current roles as accountability advocates. Their stories illustrated how a single incident, thoroughly documented and strategically leveraged, could catalyze not just institutional change, but personal transformation and professional redirection. I never intended to become an activist, Porter acknowledged. I was a corporate executive focused on quarterly metrics and shareholder value. But witnessing that moment forced me to confront the gap between professional value statements and personal moral action. Williams nodded in agreement. My sociology professors talked about systemic discrimination in theoretical terms, but seeing it happen in real time, broadcasting it to thousands of viewers who responded with immediate outrage, that showed me the power of lived experience translated through technology. Patterson added his perspective. In the corporate world, we measure everything but rarely connect those metrics to fundamental human rights. What I learned from Gate B12 was that accountability requires both documentation and consequences. The evidence alone isn't enough without mechanisms to translate that evidence into structural change. As the panel concluded, a law student asked perhaps the most fundamental question. Do you think what happened at Gate B12 could happen again today? after all these reforms? The witnesses exchanged thoughtful glances before Marcus responded. Discrimination doesn't disappear through policy changes alone. What's different now isn't that bias has been eliminated, but that accountability systems make it harder to act on that bias without consequences. Porter nodded in agreement. The reforms matter, but what matters more is the cultural shift they represent, from accepting discrimination as inevitable to expecting accountability as standard. That's the real transformation we're still working toward. Their collective journey, from witnesses to advocates, from documentation to reform, from observation to action, represented a model for how individual citizens could translate momentary injustice into lasting institutional change. The Gate B12 incident had transformed not just the airport's security protocols, but the witnesses themselves, redirecting their professional expertise and personal commitment toward a broader vision of civil rights protection in public spaces. As they left the law school event, students lined up to share their own experiences and ask about involvement opportunities. The ripple effects continued to spread outward, creating new generations of witnesses prepared not just to document injustice, but to transform it into accountability and ultimately reform. Peterson's release and redemption path. The federal halfway house in Newark bore little resemblance to the prison Richard Peterson had left 2 weeks earlier. The converted apartment building in a working-class neighborhood housed 24 federal inmates transitioning back to society after serving their sentences. Peterson's small room contained a twin bed, a desk, and a window overlooking a neighborhood park. Simple accommodations that nonetheless represented a significant step toward freedom after 28 months in federal custody. At 44, Peterson looked noticeably different from the confident officer who had approached Marcus Taylor at Gate B12 almost 3 years earlier. His hair had grayed significantly at the temples, stress lines had deepened around his eyes, and he had lost nearly 30 pounds from his once solid frame. But the most significant changes weren't physical. They were evident in his demeanor, his perspective, and his understanding of the authority he had once wielded so carelessly. He sat at the small desk, reviewing his weekly schedule. The structured routine of halfway house life included Monday, Wednesday, Friday, report to employment at Police Accountability Project, 8 a.m., 4 p.m., Tuesday, Thursday, counseling and reintegration programs, daily check-in with halfway house staff, weekends limited community privileges with prior approval. The employment placement had been unexpected. Peterson had assumed his post-release work would involve manual labor or service industry positions, the typical options for former inmates with professional backgrounds now tainted by criminal records. Instead, through an unusual sequence of events, he had been offered a position as a program assistant at the Police Accountability Project, an organization focused on reforming law enforcement practices. The connection had come through Elena Rodriguez, his former partner, who had maintained contact throughout his incarceration. Her position at Liberty International had evolved to include liaison work with civil rights organizations, including the Police Accountability Project. When the organization sought someone who could speak authentically about how authority could corrupt judgment, Rodriguez had suggested Peterson, not as an act of reconciliation, but as a practical application of his hard-earned insights. Peterson gathered his materials for the day's work, which included preparing for a presentation to Police Academy cadets about constitutional boundaries in law enforcement. The irony wasn't lost on him. The former officer convicted of civil rights violations now educating future officers about those same rights, but the perspective he offered was unique precisely because of his failure and its consequences. The halfway house regulations required Peterson to take public transportation rather than driving, so he made his way to the bus stop, conscious of the electronic monitor on his ankle, a constant reminder of his limited freedom. Fellow passengers on the bus were oblivious to his status as a federal inmate in transition, seeing only a middle-aged man in business casual attire heading to work like countless others. At the Police Accountability Project offices, Peterson was greeted by Director Maya Hernandez, a former civil rights attorney who had made the unconventional decision to hire him despite knowing his history, or rather, because of it. The Academy presentation is confirmed for Thursday, she informed him, handing over the final schedule. 24 cadets, 2 hours including Q&A. They've been told your background, so prepare for challenging questions. Peterson nodded, accepting both the assignment and its implicit difficulties. I've been working on addressing the split-second decision justification. It's what I used to believe myself, that quick judgments under pressure excuse constitutional shortcuts. And your counter to that, Hernandez asked, assessing his preparation, that constitutional boundaries aren't luxuries for calm moments. They're essential guardrails, especially during high-pressure situations. My own experience proves that when those guardrails fail, everyone loses: the officer, the citizen, the institution, public trust. Hernandez nodded approvingly. That's exactly the perspective these cadets need to hear. Not abstract legal theory, but concrete consequences from someone who's lived them. Peterson's work at the project had evolved over the 2 weeks since his release. Initially focused on administrative tasks, he had gradually begun contributing to training materials based on his firsthand understanding of how authority could corrupt judgment when unchecked by accountability. His perspective as someone who had experienced both sides of the system, wielding authority and then facing its consequences, provided insights that neither career activists nor traditional law enforcement trainers could offer. As he prepared for the academy presentation, Peterson reviewed the key points he wanted to convey to the cadets. Constitutional rights aren't obstacles to effective law enforcement. They're the foundation of legitimate authority. Discretion without accountability inevitably leads to abuse. Regardless of initial intentions, the psychological effects of unchecked authority can transform good officers into rights violators through gradual boundary erosion. Biased enforcement isn't just morally wrong, it's ineffective security practice that misallocates resources. The consequences of rights violations affect everyone: officers, departments, citizens, and community trust. These weren't abstract principles for Peterson, but hard-earned lessons from personal failure and its aftermath. His federal conviction had cost him his career, his marriage, his home, and nearly 3 years of freedom. But it had also forced a reckoning with the person he had become during 14 years of gradually escalating bias and abuse of authority. Later that afternoon, Peterson participated in a roundtable discussion with the community members about police accountability mechanisms. The conversation was challenging. Several participants initially questioned his presence, skeptical of his motivations, and doubtful of genuine change. Their skepticism was justified, he acknowledged, and could only be addressed through consistent actions rather than promises or apologies. "I'm not here claiming redemption or forgiveness," he told the group. "I'm here because my experience, both as an officer who violated rights and as someone who faced consequences for those violations, provides perspective that might help prevent others from making similar mistakes." A community activist named Jamal Washington pressed harder. "How do we know this isn't just a performance to make your post-prison life easier? People like you are good at saying what others want to hear." Peterson nodded, accepting the challenge. "You don't know, and you shouldn't take my word for it. Judge me by what I do consistently over time, not by what I say in one conversation. I have to earn credibility through actions, not claim it through words." The exchange, though uncomfortable, represented exactly the kind of accountability Peterson was still learning to accept, not as punishment, but as the necessary foundation for whatever contribution he might make going forward. His past actions had damaged trust in profound ways. Rebuilding that trust, if possible at all, would require persistent effort and genuine humility. That evening, as Peterson returned to the halfway house for the required 8 p.m. check-in, he found a letter in his mail slot. The return address made his heart rate accelerate. Taylor and Associates Law Group. He waited until he was alone in his room and before carefully opening the envelope, uncertain what communication from Marcus Taylor's firm might contain. Inside was a brief, formal note. "Mr. Peterson, the Taylor Justice Initiative is hosting a panel discussion on accountability and reform in transportation security next month. Given your unique perspective on these issues, we would like to invite you to participate as a panelist alongside former Liberty International Airport security personnel, civil rights advocates, and transportation security experts. Your direct experience with both enforcement practices and accountability mechanisms would provide valuable insights for the discussion. Participation would be voluntary and would require authorization from your probation officer. Please contact our office if you are interested in this opportunity. Respectfully, Angela Winters, Senior Counsel, Taylor Justice Initiative." Peterson read the letter 3 times, trying to understand its implications. This wasn't personal forgiveness from Marcus. It was a professional recognition that his perspective might contribute to the broader reform efforts the initiative was pursuing. The distinction mattered. True accountability wasn't about absolution, but about transforming harm into prevention. After careful consideration, Peterson took out paper and pen to draft his response. The invitation represented a potential inflection point in his post-incarceration journey, an opportunity to contribute to the reforms that his own actions had helped catalyze. Not through redemption narratives, but through honest accounting of how authority without accountability corrupts both individuals and institutions. Whether this opportunity would lead to a sustainable path forward remained uncertain. But Peterson understood more clearly now than ever before that the measure of his future contributions wouldn't be self-forgiveness or public rehabilitation, but the practical application of hard lessons to prevent others from causing similar harm. As he wrote his acceptance letter, Peterson reflected on the strange symmetry of his situation. His worst professional moment, the detention of Marcus Taylor at Gate B12, had triggered not just his personal downfall, but systemic reforms that would protect countless travelers from similar experiences. There was no satisfaction in this knowledge, only the sobering recognition that justice sometimes works through unexpected channels, transforming individual failures into institutional improvements that outlast both the harm and its consequences. Final resolution. 3 years to the day after the Gate B12 incident, Marcus Taylor stood at the same spot in Liberty International Airport where he had once been handcuffed without cause. The physical space remained largely unchanged, the same polished floors, the same gate seating, the same announcements echoing through the terminal. But the systems operating within that space had been transformed in ways both visible and subtle. Marcus observed a security officer interacting with a passenger nearby, a routine ID check conducted with clear explanation, body camera visibly active, the interaction professional and brief. The officer provided his name and badge number without prompting, explained the purpose of the check, and concluded the interaction with respectful efficiency. This wasn't performance for Marcus's benefit. The officer hadn't noticed his presence. It was simply the new standard of operation that had emerged from the comprehensive reforms implemented in the wake of the Gate B12 incident. Marcus checked his watch. He had 20 minutes before boarding his flight to Washington, D.C., where he would testify before Congress on the Federal Transportation Civil Rights Act, legislation directly inspired by his experience and the reforms it had catalyzed. The bill, which enjoyed rare bipartisan support, would establish uniform civil rights protections for travelers across all federally regulated transportation hubs. As he waited, Marcus reflected on the journey of the past 3 years, the legal proceedings, the institutional reforms, the public advocacy, and the private processing of an experience that had transformed not just his career, but his understanding of how justice functions in practice. The most meaningful outcomes hadn't been the personal vindication or even the specific consequences for Peterson, but the systemic changes that would protect countless travelers who would never know his name or story. 23 federal airports had implemented the Taylor Protocol for security operations. Transportation security training nationwide now emphasized constitutional boundaries. Civilian oversight boards had been established at 17 major transportation hubs. Discriminatory detention rates had declined by 67% at participating airports. The Taylor Justice Initiative had grown to a staff of 37 working across transportation sectors. His phone buzzed with a notification, a news alert about Richard Peterson's community presentation scheduled for that evening. The former officer, now completing his supervised release period, had become an unexpected voice in police reform conversations, speaking to academy classes and community groups about the dangers of unchecked authority and implicit bias. Marcus had attended one such presentation 6 months earlier, observing from the back of the room as Peterson described to police cadets how gradually eroding ethical boundaries had culminated in his detention of Marcus at Gate B12. There had been no direct interaction between them that night, but Marcus had recognized in Peterson's presentation something more valuable than personal apology, a commitment to translating individual failure into systemic prevention. His reflections were interrupted by the approach of Elena Rodriguez, now serving as Liberty International's Director of Constitutional Compliance, a position created as part of the consent decree reforms. "Mr. Taylor," she greeted him professionally, "I didn't realize you were traveling through today." "Congressional testimony tomorrow," he explained. "The Transportation Civil Rights Act is finally reaching the floor." Rodriguez nodded, her expression reflecting the significance of this development. "The draft legislation incorporates many of the reforms we've implemented here. The statistical monitoring, civilian oversight, body camera requirements. It's becoming the new standard. That was always the goal, Marcus acknowledged. Not just changing one airport or addressing one incident, but establishing new baselines for how security and civil rights coexist in transportation spaces. They discussed the progress of reforms at Liberty International, the continued decline in bias complaints, the improved security effectiveness metrics, the cultural shift among officers who now viewed constitutional compliance as central to their mission rather than a restriction on their authority. "There's something I've wanted to tell you," Rodriguez said as their conversation concluded. "That day at Gate B12, I should have done more to stop what was happening. I tried to intervene, but not forcefully enough. That stayed with me." Marcus considered her words carefully. "You did more than most would have, in what you've done since, implementing these reforms. Changing the culture from within, that's ultimately more important than what happened in those 20 minutes 3 years ago." As Rodriguez departed, Marcus noticed a subtle interaction nearby, a security officer approaching a passenger, then being called aside by a supervisor who quietly redirected the approach. The intervention was almost imperceptible, but Marcus recognized it as the accountability system functioning as designed preventive correction rather than post-violation punishment. This was perhaps the most profound change resulting from the Gate B12 incident, a shift from reactive discipline after rights violations to proactive prevention through multiple accountability layers. The system would never be perfect. Bias would never be completely eliminated. But the structures now in place made discriminatory practices harder to initiate and quicker to correct. As boarding began for his flight, Marcus gathered his belongings and joined the line of passengers moving toward the jet bridge. The security officer scanning boarding passes greeted each traveler with the same professional courtesy. No profiling, no targeted questioning, just a consistent application of security protocols regardless of appearance or identity. 3 years ago, Marcus had been handcuffed in this same terminal for simply existing in a space where someone with authority decided he didn't belong. Today, he moved through that space with the same rights as every other traveler, protected not by his father's name or his professional credentials, but by systems designed to ensure that constitutional protections extended to all passengers regardless of who they were or how they looked. This was the true resolution of the Gate B12 incident, not Peterson's conviction or the settlement payment or even the consent decree, but the gradual, systematic transformation of transportation security culture to recognize that safety and rights were complementary rather than competing interests. As Marcus boarded the plane bound for Washington, where he would help codify these reforms into federal law, he carried with him not just the memory of personal humiliation transformed into institutional change, but the recognition that justice, when it functions properly, creates protections that extend far beyond individual cases to reshape the fundamental relationship between authority and the citizens it serves. The plane lifted off from Liberty International Airport, rising above the terminal where a 20-minute interaction 3 years earlier had triggered changes that would affect millions of travelers for decades to come. Below, passengers continued moving through security checkpoints governed by new protocols, overseen by civilian boards, documented by body cameras, and guided by the principle that effective security required equal respect for all travelers' rights and dignity. In that ongoing transformation lay the most meaningful resolution of all, not just accountability for past wrongs, but structural prevention of future harms, not just consequences for one officer, but reformed systems that would outlast any individual case or career, not just justice for Marcus Taylor, but equal protection for every passenger passing through Gate B12 for generations to come. Have you witnessed discrimination in transportation settings? Your story matters more than you might realize. The incident at Gate B12 transformed airport security nationwide because people took action, recording, reporting, and refusing to accept civil rights violations as normal. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to join our community of 2.7 million viewers committed to accountability and justice. When you share this video, you're not just spreading a story, you're expanding awareness that can prevent similar incidents and protect constitutional rights in public spaces. If you watch closely at 7:42 in this video, you'll notice the critical piece of evidence that prosecutors later used to prove Peterson knew exactly what he was doing. Comment below if you spotted it, and tag someone who needs to understand their rights during security screenings. Remember, cameras change behavior. Documentation creates accountability. And when we stand together as witnesses, Justice becomes possible even in systems that once seemed immune to change.